November 4, 1862. Cold rain drizzles down on Indianapolis as freight cars grind to a stop beside the crowded depot, and every sliding door reveals more soldiers whose uniforms are soaked through with blood and mud. Men lie in rows on straw, faces gray, arms wrapped in makeshift slings, legs missing beneath rough wool blankets that do little to hide the empty space. Orderlies shout for space on wagons, surgeons call for more bandages, and the smell of wet wool, iron, and opened flesh fills the platform and lingers in the still air. Richard Jordan Gatling stands under the station eaves, watching stretcher after stretcher pass, and counts not the uniforms but the hands that can still grip a musket. The war has already consumed thousands of men from Indiana alone, and Gatling knows the regiments that still march out of the city will return with fewer faces each time. He has spent his life building devices that move grain, plant seeds, and help a few workers do the labor of many. And as the trains keep arriving, he sees the same problem spread across the whole conflict. Every regiment depends on lines of men who stand shoulder to shoulder and fire single-shot rifles that must be reloaded by hand, one cartridge at a time, with every trigger pull costing a few vital seconds. Each man plays a specific role in a tightly ordered line, and when enough arms and legs are lost, the unit slows down or fails. Looking at the line of wagons waiting to carry away the wounded, he decides that the way to spare flesh is to replace some of it with steel. Gatling returns to his workshop near the river with the image of the depot fixed in his mind, and clears a space on the long bench that is usually crowded with seed drills and other farm tools. The idea is simple when he first sketches it. A cluster of rifled barrels arranged around a central shaft, each with its own breech, each ready to fire as the shaft turns. Instead of a single man loading and firing one shot at a time, a crank would drive the whole cluster, bringing loaded chambers under the firing mechanism in steady sequence. A hopper or magazine mounted on top would feed cartridges down by gravity, letting the gun receive line after line of rounds as long as the operator kept turning the handle. If one barrel overheated or fouled, the others would still be cooling as they waited their turn, so the stream of bullets would remain steady while the barrels rotated in and out of the firing position. He builds the first crude model with plain iron barrels and a frame that looks closer to a piece of farm machinery than a battlefield weapon. Wood shavings and metal filings mix on the floor as he files, drills, and reworks parts that bind or misalign when the crank turns. Springs break, extractors tear cases, and at first the barrels spit and cough rather than send out a smooth series of shots. Yet every problem is mechanical, something that can be solved with a stronger pin, a smoother cam surface, or a more balanced set of gears. Not a problem of courage or human endurance. Day after day, he adjusts tolerances and reshapes parts, telling visitors that the goal is not a faster way to kill, but a way to allow a smaller number of men to hold a position without pouring so many bodies into the line. By autumn, he has a version that will fire a sustained series of rounds when the crank turns, and now the problem is to prove that the new gun can work outside the workshop. He arranges a demonstration on the outskirts of the city where the open field stretches away from a low rise, and local officials gather in their overcoats to see the inventor's latest contrivance. The gun sits on a simple carriage with two high wooden wheels, its cluster of barrels pointed at a row of wooden targets set at battlefield ranges. An ammunition box is opened, and metallic cartridges are poured into the hopper until it is nearly full. A dull stream of brass that gleams when the clouds briefly break. Gatling steps behind the weapon, grips the crank, and with a final check of the mechanism begins to turn the handle. The first few rotations are slow while he listens to the timing of the moving parts, then he increases the speed until the barrels blur together in front of the carriage. Each quarter turn brings a firing pin down onto a primer, and a continuous chopping roar rolls across the field as empty cases flick away and smoke pours from the muzzles. The wooden figures downrange, splinter, and jump as bullet after bullet slams into their boards, and within moments the front row is shredded into sagging sticks. Where a row of infantry would have fired a few volleys in the same span of time, this single machine sends out a dense pattern of fire that would have required a whole company of soldiers to match with conventional rifles. When the hopper runs dry and the crank finally slows, a faint metallic ticking comes from the cooling barrels, and the sweet, sharp smell of powder smoke hangs thick around the carriage. Some of the watching officers step forward at once, drawn by the evidence on the ruined targets, while others hold back with arms crossed, skeptical of a contrivance that replaces disciplined file firing with mechanical speed. They question the reliability of a weapon that depends on so many moving parts, ask what happens if mud clogs the feed, or if an enemy artillery shell strikes the carriage and leaves the crew helpless beside their disabled gun. Gatling answers each concern in turn, pointing out that the crew would be smaller than a full infantry company, and that the gun can be protected by earthworks just as any cannon can. He explains that the operator can control the rate of fire with the crank, that short bursts can be used to conserve ammunition, and that the barrels are simple enough to clean between engagements. The machine cannot remove danger from war, he says, but it can enable fewer men to do the work that currently burns through the lives of many. In the weeks that follow, he prepares detailed drawings and descriptions for the patent office, translating the clatter of gears and barrels into language that examiners will understand. Every component is labeled, every stage of the firing cycle is described, from the moment a cartridge slides into place beneath the hopper to the instant its empty shell drops away after firing. He writes that the purpose of the gun is to bring a far greater volume of fire to bear with a small crew, allowing commanders to defend key positions without assembling long lines of infantry along the breastworks. The diagrams show the rotating cluster and the mechanism that cocks and releases each hammer in precise sequence as the crank moves. He encloses photographs of the damaged targets from the Indianapolis demonstration, so that the examiners can see in plain boards what the rate of fire means in practice. When the patent is granted and the date of November is fixed on the document, the design becomes more than a workshop curiosity. It is now a recognized invention identified in official registers, something that can be manufactured, sold, and fielded under the protection of law. Gatling begins seeking contracts and partners who can help move the weapon from the prototype stage into regular production, knowing that castings, barrels, and precise machining will require industrial capacity beyond his own shop. He approaches ordnance officials and presents the weapon as a tool that can hold bridges, depots, and fortified positions against far larger attacking forces. The idea is clear on paper and on the range, yet the United States Army is slow to change established patterns of doctrine and procurement, while a massive war already strains its resources. Private purchasers and individual commanders take more immediate interest, seeing in the weapon a way to thicken the fire in narrow sectors where the enemy is expected to press hardest. A few guns are bought with personal funds and assigned to guard important approaches, such as key crossroads and the mouths of trenches that lead toward vital rail lines supplying armies in the field. Where they are posted, infantrymen study the rotating barrels with a mixture of curiosity and caution, wondering whether they will be shielded by the new gun or overshadowed by it. Crews learn to feed the hopper smoothly, to clear misfeeds, and to keep their hands away from exposed gears that will crush fingers if care slips during the press of battle. Early practice shows that the gun needs steady, deliberate operation rather than frantic cranking, because a consistent rate of fire prevents jams and keeps ammunition from being wasted. On quiet evenings in camps where a Gatling has been assigned, Soldiers gather near the carriage and imagine what it will look like when waves of attackers step into its arc. They picture ranks advancing with bayonets fixed and flags lifted high, only to feel a stream of bullets cut across the front edge before the leading men can fire their first volley. The mental picture is stark rather than glorious, a calculation of how many bodies might fall before the machine needs a fresh hopper of cartridges. Some men admit that the idea unsettles them because it changes the balance between individual skill and mechanical output that has governed combat for generations. Others focus on the practical side, recognizing that anything which strengthens their position may lift the odds that they will survive to see the end of the war. Reports of the gun's performance travel unevenly through commands, carried by letters, official dispatches, and word of mouth from officers who have watched it run. In some sectors, conservative ordnance officers dismiss it as a noisy novelty that could distract from the proven combination of rifled muskets, artillery, and disciplined drill. In others, more flexible commanders ask for demonstrations and consider how small detachments of trained crewmen might anchor critical junctures in their defensive lines. The gun's advocates describe scenarios in which a handful of men at the crank can hold a road or a breach that would otherwise require companies of infantry rotating through the front to keep up a continuous fire. Slowly, a new expectation develops within the army of a future in which certain points on a battlefield are defined not by massed ranks, but by clusters of barrels served by mechanics in uniform. While decisions crawl through official channels, the war's cost continues to mount across the states. Fields from Tennessee to Virginia fill with temporary graves marked by rough boards and simple inscriptions that record names, regiments, and dates of death. Hospitals remain crowded with long wards of cots holding men who bear the scars of rifle fire, disease, and amputation. Newspaper columns list casualties in long sequences of names that reach across entire pages, and families in far-off towns read them with dread, searching for familiar letters. Every such list underscores the argument that any weapon which can allow smaller garrisons to hold vital positions might reduce the number of men sent into lethal range. As the conflict nears its end, the army that will later march westward is already changing in character. Officers who have seen Gatling guns on firing ranges or in limited field service carry that memory with them, along with lessons learned from years of entrenched warfare. They have watched how concentrated fire from tightly grouped rifles and artillery can stop charges that would once have broken through thin lines. They have seen how earthworks, trenches, and fortified positions can turn open fields into killing zones that favor defenders over attackers. In their minds, the rotating barrels and hand-cranked mechanism of the new gun belong to the same family of tools that concentrate force in narrow spaces. For the moment, the gun remains a specialized asset used in small numbers, overshadowed by the millions of single-shot rifles that still dominate the trenches and open fields. Yet its design points toward a future in which the speed of fire no longer depends on how quickly a man can reload under pressure, but on how steadily a trained crew can turn a handle. The mechanical rhythm tested on that chilly Indianapolis field will eventually reach far beyond the rail lines and depots of the eastern states. In years to come, crates bearing the familiar cluster of barrels will follow columns of infantry and cavalry as they move into plains and canyons that have not yet seen iron tracks or telegraph poles. There, the same principle that began as a response to the overwhelming casualty lists of the Civil War will meet mounted warriors who have long trusted courage and speed to carry them across open ground toward distant stockades. August 24, 1866. Morning heat hangs over the Washington Arsenal grounds beside the Potomac River, and the broad parade field smells of trampled grass, coal smoke from the workshops, and river mud drifted in on the humid air. A cluster of officers in dark frock coats stands near a temporary firing line, boots dusty, hats tilted back just enough to see the far targets mounted on heavy wooden frames. Ordnance clerks carry leather folders and notebooks ready to record every detail of the day's trials, from misfires and stoppages to the number of rounds discharged within a measured span of time. In front of them sits the latest production model of Richard Gatling's gun, its multiple barrels set firmly on a new iron and wood carriage that looks more finished than the earlier prototypes the board has heard about in past months. An artillery detachment from the regular army waits beside the weapon, jackets unbuttoned in the heat, sleeves rolled, faces already streaked with sweat. They have spent days learning to assemble and disassemble this new piece, studying how the feed system aligns, how the crank moves the breech, how to clear a hung cartridge without damaging the internals. Beside the gun stand, several wooden crates marked with stenciled letters and numbers, each filled with metallic cartridges that gleam when the tops are pried off. The officers want to know not only how quickly the gun fires, but how it behaves over extended use, how the barrels heat, how the brass cases extract after prolonged firing. Nothing on the board's schedule speaks about the frontier, but several of these men have marched through western posts and know that what they decide here will eventually reach stone and timber forts standing along rivers far beyond the capital. The senior ordnance officer gives a short nod and the crew steps forward. Two men lift the hopper lid and pour in cartridges until the stack presses near the top, then settle it back into place and check that no rounds are crossways in the feed channel. The gun captain grips the crank handle, waits for the signal, and at the shout from the line officer begins turning his arm in a steady, practiced motion. The first few reports crack across the field, each shot clear and distinct, then blend into a harsh, continuous rhythm as the barrels rotate and the mechanism finds its working pace. Empty brass arcs away from the side of the carriage, collecting on the ground in a spreading pile, while thin blue smoke wraps around the cluster of muzzles and drifts downwind toward the river. Downrange, planks nailed over earthen mounds jump and splinter. The board has placed them at measured distances marked in chalk on stakes driven into the soil so that they can later count impacts and calculate accuracy at various ranges. Behind the nearest row of targets stand thicker oak posts to test penetration, each one cut from seasoned timber that once served as part of a bridge frame. The watching officers see chips fly from those posts as heavy bullets punch through front boards and drive on. Timekeepers shout out the passing seconds and clerks mark how many rounds have been delivered by the end of each interval. After a long burst, the gun captain eases his arm, letting the crank slow and stop while the barrels click softly as they coast to rest. The crew chief calls out the count from his own tally, a rough total of the cartridges fed through the hopper for that string. Another team moves in with long rods and cloth soaked in oil to run through each barrel, inspecting for heavy fouling and checking that the rifling remains sharp. One officer steps close, lays the back of his hand near but not on the barrels, and nods when he feels the heat rolling from the metal. He notes the temperature in his book using the simple field description they have agreed upon, recording whether the gun still functions when the barrels are merely warm, very warm, or nearly scorching. They repeat the trial in variations throughout the day. In some strings, the gun is run at a moderate pace to see how a careful crew might conserve ammunition while still providing dense fire. In others, the captain is ordered to crank as fast as his strength and the mechanism permit to explore the upper limit of sustained discharge before stoppages multiply, or the hopper feed struggles to keep pace. On one such run, a cartridge sticks hard in the chamber and the handle jams solid. The crew chief calls out. The captain releases his grip at once and a second man moves in with a short tool to work the case free while the officers watch the clearing procedure as closely as they watched the firing. By mid-afternoon, the ground near the carriage is littered with spent brass, twisted splinters, and scraps of paper from cartridge packaging. The crew's dark uniforms show streaks of powder grime and oil, their cuffs and collars stained from repeated handling of hot metal and lubricants. The gun itself bears blackened streaks around the muzzles and along the frame, testimony to the constant movement of burning gases and residue through its parts. The board calls a halt and walks downrange with measuring tapes and notebooks, stepping around shattered boards that now sag from their uprights. For each distance, clerks count and mark the bullet strikes, describe the size of the holes, and examine how deeply the rounds drove into the posts behind the facing planks. Under the shade of a nearby shed, the officers gather to speak openly. They compare today's performance with what they know of conventional artillery and rifle fire, noting the obvious difference that this gun needs no ramming of charges, no reloading by multiple crew members at the muzzle. One captain who served on major battlefields during the recent war points out how much time it takes for a line of infantry to deliver a coordinated volley and then reload, especially once fatigue and fear begin to slow hands. Another officer remarks that this machine produces a steady stream of bullets without waiting for commands to prime, load, and fire. The chief of the board listens, thumb on his notebook, then asks about reliability, transport, and maintenance in the field. They discuss the weight of the carriage and whether it can be moved with horse teams over rough ground, just as a light cannon would be. They consider if the ammunition can be manufactured in quantity and shipped easily to depots in the interior. One man who has inspected Western posts mentions that small forts beyond the Mississippi often sit with thin garrisons and long supply lines, with only a few companies of infantry spread across long walls and outlying blockhouses. To him, a weapon that concentrates heavy fire in one small crew offers a means to stiffen a vulnerable gate or a narrow approach. Others nod, picturing stone bastions on the Missouri and Arkansas rivers, timber palisades on the plains, and remote redoubts on canyon rims in territories where the Army now plans to extend its presence. The board's written recommendation takes shape over the next days at Ordnance Headquarters. In careful script, clerks record that the gun shows a high rate of fire, acceptable accuracy at the tested ranges, and manageable levels of fouling when cleaned between protracted engagements. They note the instances of malfunction and how quickly trained crews corrected them under supervision. They also acknowledge the gun's appetite for ammunition, remarking that its usefulness depends on secure supply for metallic cartridges, not loose powder and caps. Despite reservations, the final text concludes that the United States should adopt the weapon in a limited but formal way, with specified models accepted for service and ordered in numbers sufficient for experimental deployment. When the decision is signed and dated in late August, it enters the Army's records as one more line on a long list of accepted arms, yet its meaning reaches beyond the ink. Contracts are drawn up with the manufacturers who will cut the barrels, machine the frames, and assemble the feed mechanisms under government inspection. Inspectors travel to factories to gauge bore diameters, check steel quality, and stamp their marks on finished barrels that meet the new standard. In workshops in the Northeast, men at lathes and drill presses shape the components that will later sit under the hands of crews in places none of them have seen. Each completed gun is crated with care, packed in straw and fitted snugly into custom boxes labeled with its pattern, serial numbers, and destination arsenal. Rail lines now stretch farther than they did when Richard Gatling watched those first trains of wounded men years earlier, and the government uses that network to move the new guns. From factories in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, flat cars carry the crates to major depots in cities such as New York and Philadelphia. From there, other trains roll west toward St. Louis and other central hubs, where large brick arsenals sit near the rivers that tie the interior together. At each stop, quartermasters check manifests against the physical crates, ensuring that none have been misrouted or damaged. Telegraph messages confirm arrivals and departures, linking ordnance offices in Washington with storekeepers who will oversee distribution to departmental commands. In St. Louis, where the rivers converge and the traffic of men and goods never really pauses, the first Gatling crates for the Department of the Missouri sit stacked in a high-walled yard. The arsenal buildings smell of oil, old powder, and timber soaked with decades of weather. An ordnance sergeant in charge of inventory opens one crate under orders, pries out the packing material, and sees the clustered barrels resting in their wooden bed. He has read about the gun in circulars but never touched one, and he runs his hand along the machined surfaces before rewrapping each part. Then he signs the papers that release this and other crates to the department's transport officers. Some of the guns will remain in the central arsenal as reserve, but others are slated for posts along key routes where the Army expects friction. Orders send a pair toward the Kansas frontier, where forts watch over approaches used by emigrant trains and stage lines. Another set is assigned to posts that guard lines running toward the northern plains, where Lakota and Cheyenne bands have already shown their willingness to contest survey parties and supply columns. In each case, wagon masters receive the shipments and balance their loads, combining boxes of small arms cartridges, kegs of powder, replacement rifles, and the heavy crates that hold the new machines. Teams of mules or oxen lean into their harnesses and drag the loads out of the arsenal yard, over cobbled streets and onto roads that lead toward prairies and open skies. As the crates move, departmental commanders receive circulars that explain the basic employment of the new guns. The language is plain. The weapons are to be mounted where they can cover approaches to gates, bridges, or critical crossings, or else held mobile with field columns as a means to deliver sustained fire at decisive points. Instructions emphasize crew training, stressing that only men drilled in the feed and clearing procedures should operate the cranks in action. Officers are reminded that ammunition consumption will be high, and that careful control of the firing rate is necessary. Where possible, they are told to construct simple embrasures or earth cover to shield the guns and their crews from direct musket and arrow fire. Weeks later, at a frontier post on the plains, a set of unfamiliar crates arrives in the fort yard, trailing dust from the long wagon journey. The fort's walls, built of stone or thick timber, stand above sparse grasslands broken by creek beds and low rises, with the flag snapping in a steady, prairie wind. Infantry companies here have grown used to the rhythm of garrison duty, drilling on the parade ground, patrolling outlying trails, and repairing stockade sections weathered by wind and winter. They gather around as the quartermaster and an ordnance non-commissioned officer open the new boxes. When the clustered barrels and gearwork appear, a murmur runs through the watching men who have heard stories of new mitrailleuse-style guns used overseas but never seen one in person. Under the post commander's eye, a detail of selected soldiers begins formal instruction. They move each component to a cleared space near the fort's small powder magazine, then assemble the carriage following the diagrams sent from the arsenal. Barrels are slid into their frame, secured by bolts and collars tightened to specified torque under the guidance of the ordnance man. The feed system is mounted and checked, the crank attached, and the elevation and traverse mechanisms tested to see how smoothly the gun tracks an imagined target. The post blacksmith stands by, ready to modify fittings if needed, though the weapon fits together without complaint. Training days follow a tight schedule. At first, crews practice loading dummy cartridges into the hopper, turning the crank slowly while an instructor watches for hesitation. They rehearse clearing drills until hands find the right tools by instinct, and they learn how to strip the gun down to major components for cleaning at the end of each session. The commander orders limited live fire so that the men understand the recoil, the noise, and the way the barrels heat over time. Targets are set along a dry riverbed outside the fort, and the sound of rapid fire echoes off the banks while scouts from nearby tribes hired as guides or watching from concealment take note of the new thunder that now rolls from inside the palisade. In officers' meetings inside the fort's small headquarters building, maps are laid out on a rough wooden table. Lines are drawn from the main gate toward the nearest creek crossings, trading posts, and wagon routes. The commander and his subordinates mark likely avenues of approach for any large hostile party that might seek to ride close enough to set fire to hay, cut loose stock, or probe the walls. They discuss where to place the new gun so that it can throw fire along those routes without being easily flanked. Some argue for a position on a corner bastion that overlooks both the main trail and the ford, while others favor a protected platform just behind the gate that could sweep the open ground directly in front of the entrance. The decision at this particular post is to mount the gun on a raised platform behind an angle of the wall where two firing lines intersect. Carpenters build a sturdy base with thick planks and braces so that the carriage wheels will not shift under recoil. A wooden screen is erected to break the wind and catch some of the dust and debris that constant firing would kick up, while still allowing the crew to see the field in front of them. From this position, the barrels can be traversed to cover the main trail, the open space where herds graze during the day, and the shallow draw that has served as cover for raiding parties in years past. When the gun is finally rolled into place and secured, every man in the garrison knows that the fort's face has changed in a way that any future attacker will feel. Farther east, in departmental headquarters housed in brick buildings in cities such as Leavenworth or Omaha, staff officers add notes to their contingency plans. When they write about reinforcing threatened posts or sending out columns to relieve besieged garrisons, they now include references to machine guns alongside artillery and cavalry. They plan routes that will allow them to haul ammunition boxes in sufficient numbers to keep the guns supplied if a post is cut off. Telegraph messages between these headquarters and Washington mention the new weapon not as an experiment on a range, but as part of the regular material of war now spread thinly across the frontier. The quiet administrative work completes what began on the Washington Arsenal field, binding the rotating barrels to the fate of scattered forts that dot the rivers and plains of the interior. Low clouds spread across the Missouri River as dawn creeps past the palisades of Fort Rice on a cool September morning in 1871. Inside the walls, the parade ground that usually holds tight infantry formations is crowded with supply wagons, spare horses, stacked crates, and a column of men that stretches from the sally port almost to the flagpole. The post band stands ready near the gate, instruments wrapped in oilcloth against the chance of rain, while officers move among the companies checking lists one final time. For weeks, word has run along the barracks that the fort will send a strong escort west to shield Northern Pacific surveyors who intend to push through lands that Lakota war parties still cross at will. Nothing about the load in the yard looks ordinary, from the number of wagons to the presence of heavy weapon crates that no one remembers seeing here before. Major Joseph Whistler, hat pulled low over his brow, rides slowly along the line on a compact bay horse, stopping wherever a sergeant raises a question. He commands several companies of infantry for this expedition, reinforced by an artillery detachment, Indian scouts, and the civilian survey party that will map the rough country between the Little Heart River and the Yellowstone. The whole escort numbers many hundreds of men when wagon drivers and teamsters are counted, enough to form a solid line around the engineers when the column halts to work. Sioux bands have harried travelers and struck at steamboats along the upper river in recent years, and the officers here know that a light escort would invite ambush in the broken hills that lie west of the Missouri. Orders from higher command demanded a strong guard for this mission, and the formation in front of Whistler reflects that decision. Near the inner wall, two squat iron-framed weapons sit on traveling carriages between regular field pieces. Each has a cluster of short barrels fixed around a central shaft with a hand crank at the rear and a feeding fixture perched above the breeches. These are the fort's new Gatling guns, assigned to the escort as a final answer to any large mounted force that tries to sweep the column from the flanks. Artillerymen from the post have trained on them for days, learning to seat cartridges in the hopper, to keep the mechanism oiled, and to give the crank a steady, even turn. Now their guns wait with covers folded back, muzzles pointed through the gate toward open plains that roll away on the far side of the river. Indian scouts gather in a loose group near the outer corner of the parade ground, mounted on lean ponies scarred by old wounds and hard use. Most wear a mix of army-issue clothing and traditional dress, breechclouts and leggings under blue coats with eagle feathers or trade cloth tied into their braids. They have hunted and fought on these lands long before the fort rose above the riverbank, and they know every coulee, ridge, and draw that crosses the planned route. Some once rode with war parties against the same uniformed men who now pay them as guides and interpreters, and they watch the Gatling cruise with an expression that mixes curiosity and memory. They have seen companies of infantry struggle to reload when riders swarm close, and they understand the difference a continuous stream of bullets could make if a large charge moves into its path. When the sun clears the low clouds, the departing column begins to roll. Wagons loaded with rations and forage rumble through the open gate first, wheels creaking under the weight of flour barrels, dried meat, coffee, and sacks of grain. Behind them, more wagons carry survey equipment, transit stands, camp tools, and boxed instruments packed in straw. Infantry companies march in ordered files beside and behind the rolling train, rifles held at the carry, cartridge boxes strapped tight over coarse wool coats. At the center of the procession, the artillery detachment moves out, field pieces and Gatling carriages alike pulled by teams that snort and toss their heads at the first steep grade beyond the fort. From the bluff above the river, a thin line of smoke rises where a small group of Lakota watchers tends a low fire shielded from the wind. They look down on the fort and see the column extending out along the road, dust already beginning to lift from the trail. Through gaps in the morning haze, they note the number of horses, count the wagons as best they can, and watch the odd machines with clustered barrels that roll in the midst of the guns. One of the older men has fought at places where muskets and carbines reloaded in slow rhythm between volleys, and he frowns at the sight of a carriage that seems to carry many barrels at once. He says little, but younger warriors beside him follow his gaze and fix the new weapons in their thoughts as they saddle up to shadow the march. Once the column has crossed the ferry and climbed the western bank, the land changes from river bottom to open rolling prairie. Bunches of buffalo grass and sagebrush sway under the wind. Prairie dog mounds dot the ground, and distant buttes rise in pale bands against the far horizon. The route follows earlier trails westward, but the escort pushes into regions where few white surveyors have yet walked. Engineers ride close to the head of the train, stopping often to take sightings, set markers, and adjust their notes while enlisted men hold the horses and keep an eye on the ridges. Behind them, the line of infantry and wagons strings out across the grass, always keeping the guns near the center where they can be brought forward quickly. Even before the column reaches the Badlands proper, the country begins to break and twist. Flat stretches give way to eroded ravines where rainwater has carved soft rock into steep banks that crumble under careless boots. Low ridges throw off narrow spurs that funnel the trail into tight spaces where a few riders could panic the mule teams if they charged close enough. Whistler sees this and shifts his companies accordingly, sending some units ahead to secure the next stretch of high ground and placing others along the flanks near likely cover. The Gatling crews march with their carriages close to the center of these formations, ready to pivot toward any alarm that runs down the line. At midday on one long march, scouts ride back from a rise with word that mounted Lakota are watching from a distant ridge. They report no large camp nearby, only small parties riding parallel to the column, always just beyond clear carbine range. The news is no surprise, but it hardens the way officers look at the ground ahead. Whistler halts the train in a shallow basin where the earth offers some shelter and gives orders for a defensive arrangement while the engineers take hurried measurements. Wagons pull into a loose rectangle, infantry companies move to the edges, and the two Gatling guns roll to slight rises where their barrels can see over the teams toward the suspected approaches. For the first time on this expedition, the fort's new weapons sit in positions much like those they would occupy in a fight. Carriage wheels are chocked with rocks, elevation screws are cranked to match the contour of the slope, and ammunition boxes are stacked close by. The crews open the hopper lids and pour in metallic cartridges until the stacks reach the upper edge, then leave the lids propped so they can feed more rounds without hesitation if ordered. Each man knows his job from drill at the fort, one at the crank, one minding the feed, one watching for jams, and others ready to carry more boxes forward from the wagons. From the ridges, Lakota observers see the column halt and tighten, and they notice the way the strange carriages are placed to cover open approaches where a charge might otherwise rush toward the engineers. No orders come to fire that day. The small bands watching from the high ground keep their distance, never closing far enough to draw more than an occasional warning shot from flankers with carbines. They test the line with their presence alone, riding in and out of sight, raising faint dust clouds and signaling to one another with flashes from small mirrors. Inside the makeshift square, the Gatling crews sweat in the late heat, hands resting on crank handles and feed frames, eyes moving between the ridge lines and the tightly packed wagons. They listen to the creak and thump of hooves and wheels, the murmur of low voices among the infantry, and the distant calls of the scouts as the hours stretch. Days lengthen into weeks as the column pushes westward. The trail grows harsher, breaking into twisted canyons and steep ridges of the Dakota Badlands where layers of clay, ash, and stone stand out sharp under the sky. Wagons strain on steep pitches, hooves slide on loose rock, and men lead sweating animals down narrow switchbacks cut by earlier movements. At night, campfires burn low in sheltered draws, and picket lines are stretched tight as guards scan the dark ridges for any silhouette that moves where it should not. The Gatling guns are parked near the center of camp each evening, their carriages turned so that, if needed, their barrels can be swung toward whichever side of the perimeter receives the first alarm. Lakota parties continue to shadow the expedition, appearing on distant buttes at dawn or evening, counting wagons, judging the strength of the escort, and then fading back into folds of ground that only they know thoroughly. They see how each time the column halts, soldiers throw out skirmishers, occupy small rises, and keep the strange machines near points where several trails meet. They understand that surprise, once their strongest tool, will be harder to achieve against a force that can fill a draw with bullets before riders on fast horses can cross it. Some young men still talk around their own fires of bold charges, of counting coup on soldiers within sight of the flag on the fort. But older leaders caution that this moving camp differs from the light escorts of past years. They weigh the chance of capturing stock or striking the surveyors against the risk of losing many horses and lives in a few minutes under the new pattern of firepower. The column reaches the Yellowstone after weeks of cautious advance, with survey lines laid, maps taking shape, and no major fight recorded in the escort's ledgers. There are tense moments in narrow passes, sudden alarms when smoke appears where no camp should be, and fleeting glimpses of riders on far ridges, but no full-scale rush of warriors into the muzzles of the guns. Instead, the expedition's story is one of work carried out under constant threat, with the Gatling guns serving as a visible warning of what will happen if that threat becomes action. The surveyors complete their measurements along the river and mark possible bridge sites, while the soldiers keep steady watch over the camps and crossings. When Whistler finally turns his command back toward Fort Rice, the guns roll home unblooded but not untested. On the return march, men speak more freely about what the expedition has shown them. Infantry sergeants who have walked beside wagon trains on earlier routes say that no prior escort felt as secure in open country as this one did when the guns were in sight. Artillerymen describe how quickly they can bring a Gatling into action compared with limbering a regular cannon and preparing shell or case shot. Indian scouts talk among themselves about the meetings they will have in their own camps, where they will describe the machines that pour fire without long pauses to reload. Some count the expedition's lack of open battle as evidence that the escort's display of strength did its job before a shot ever had to be aimed at a human target. Others note that the same strength that protected the surveyors will soon shield track crews and garrisons that follow in their path. The column rides back through the gate at Fort Rice in October. The band plays, officers salute, and families of soldiers line the edges of the parade ground to greet weary faces. The engineers report that their mission has succeeded, that they have traced a workable route across country that once was known only to buffalo herds and the people who hunted them. In the evening, lanterns glow in the fort's assembly hall while a celebration honors the safe return of both civilian and military participants. Under that roof, talk runs from the rough country and bad water to the new gun that marched with the command, its barrels now cool in the fort yard outside. No warriors charged the moving square on this journey, yet everyone present understands that if they had, the answer waiting for them would have been unlike anything seen on these plains before. August 1, 1872. Heat presses down on the Missouri riverbank as soldiers at Fort Rice tighten saddle cinches and lift heavy ammunition crates into waiting wagons. Colonel David Stanley walks along the shaded edge of the parade ground with his field glasses tucked under one arm, stopping now and then to speak with officers who stand beside their companies. The fort has already heard what happened to smaller survey escorts in earlier seasons. How small parties of Lakota riders harassed them, cut loose stock, and scattered them from fragile camps along the unfinished route of the Northern Pacific Line. This time the escort is stronger, and near the center of the growing column stand two new guns on traveling carriages, each with a cluster of short barrels and a hand crank waiting for a crewman's grip. The men who serve those pieces are artillery soldiers detailed from their regular duties with field guns. They have spent weeks on a bare patch of ground behind the fort rehearsing every movement involved in operating the battery guns at speed. One has charge of the crank, another minds the feed and keeps cartridges moving. Others handle ammunition boxes and tools, all under a sergeant who counts every stoppage during drill. They have learned how to break the guns down far enough to clear a jammed case without losing springs or pins in the dust. They know how hot the barrels become after a long burst and how quickly the pile of empty brass rises under the breeches when the handle turns steadily. Stanley halts beside one carriage and looks over the weapon in silence. His staff officers stand around him, hats pulled low against the glare, while the post commander goes down a checklist of the escort's composition. Infantry from the 22nd United States Infantry, a detachment of cavalry, scouts, teamsters, engineers, and the surveyors themselves, all counted and assigned. Supply wagons carry flour, bacon, coffee, forage, canvas, spare shoes, tools, and medical stores, stacked and lashed until each wagon box feels hard as a wall under the hand. The new guns add extra weight, but no one questions their inclusion, not after the reports that have already reached departmental headquarters about the ease with which mounted warriors can close on slower columns. By mid-morning, the fort's gate stands open and the column begins to move out in measured sequence. Band music follows the first steps, then fades as the last companies pass beyond the sound of the parade ground. Dust boils up under the hooves of the lead cavalry troop, then rolls back over the marching infantry and rumbles through the wagon train. The Gatling carriages follow close behind a pair of light field pieces so that the artillery detachment can keep its crews together. One team prepared to fire shell at distant targets, the other ready to sweep nearer ground with a solid stream of bullets. As the wagons clear the outer works and descend toward the ferry, engineers look back once more at the fort's stone walls, knowing there will be no such stronghold around them once they push deeper into the valley of the Yellowstone. Across the river, Lakota watchers sit their ponies on a low ridge, faces shaded by broad brims and wrapped scarves. They have seen soldiers leave this fort many times, sometimes in small patrols, sometimes in heavier columns, and they count the number of wagons by the dust line that crawls behind the moving shapes. Today they notice the heavy carriages with short barrels turning slightly as the teams adjust on the slope. They mark the positions where these guns roll in the line, near the center where the most valuable equipment rides. One of the older men recalls hearing about a weapon that fires faster than even the quickest soldier can reload, and he says that any future fight with this column will need to think about those barrels before anything else. On the first days, the route follows familiar ground, rolling prairie with wide views in every direction. The column stretches out over the grass, cavalry scouts ahead and on the wings, infantry close around the wagons, artillery moving in the middle. When the sun is high, heat shimmers over the trail and the smell of sweat, leather, and mule teams hangs over the whole formation. Stanley rides often near the front, but he also falls back through the ranks to see for himself how each part of the escort is holding up under the load and the pace. He glances repeatedly at the battery guns and at the ammunition wagons assigned to keep them supplied, fully aware that the guns are only as useful as the stock of cartridges that follow behind. As they press west, the land grows rougher. Low swells give way to broken hills and shallow ravines cut by seasonal streams that now run nearly dry. Short grass gives way in places to bare dirt and scattered sage, and wagon wheels bite deep into patches of soft ground near dry creek beds. Crossings must be chosen carefully so that teams do not bog down and leave the trains strung out and vulnerable. The Gatling carriages are kept near solid central tracks, not allowed to wander onto edges where a collapsed bank could topple a carriage into a wash. The first real test of the march comes when scouts ride in with word that a sizable party of Lakota has been following for more than a day just beyond carbine range. They report dust plumes on distant rises, glints of sunlight on weapons, and occasional flashes of color from painted shields and shirts. Stanley calls a halt in a shallow basin near a low ridge and orders the column into a defensive arrangement while the surveyors catch up and the animals rest under guard. Wagons pull in to form a rough rectangle. Infantry companies take up positions at the outer edges, and the artillery detachment brings both field pieces and Gatlings to slight rises where their crews can see over the heads of the men in front. The air holds a tight stillness as everyone waits to see whether the watchers on the ridges will decide to come closer. Late afternoon light throws long shadows across the grass when the first group of riders appears along a ridge on the western side of the basin. They are not a full war party, but they are numerous enough that their presence draws a line of rifles to shoulders along the infantry positions. The riders move back and forth along the crest, stopping now and then to look down at the parked wagons and troops below. More figures appear on adjacent ridges, separate clusters that signal to each other with arm motions and the controlled movement of their horses. From the ground inside the laager, it feels as if the whole basin is under inspection from every angle. Stanley gives orders that no one is to fire without command. He wants to avoid provoking an unnecessary fight, but he refuses to allow any weakness that might invite a rush. He directs the artillery captain to unlimber a field piece and point it toward the strongest concentration of riders on the highest ridge, then turns his attention to the Gatling crews. They roll one gun forward to a little swell of ground that gives it a clear field of view over the westward approaches, chock the wheels, and set the elevation to reach the nearer ridges. Ammunition boxes are opened, cartridges lifted out and stacked within easy reach while the gun captain reaches up to feel the smooth motion of the feed mechanism under his fingers. For a long time, nothing more happens. Just the silent exchange of looks across the basin. Then as the sun sinks and the sky reddens toward the horizon, a tight group of riders suddenly drops off one of the slopes and heads at a steady lope toward the grazing herd at the north end of the camp. Their ponies move with practiced speed, manes blowing, each rider bent low, shields slung, lances or guns held close. They are still outside easy rifle range when the alarm runs through the nearest infantry company. Men shout, the herd guards start whipping mules and horses toward the center, and the line at the northern edge stiffens and takes aim. Stanley rides to the Gatling already positioned on the slight rise. He points with his glove toward the approaching group and gives a firm order to be ready, but not to fire until the riders commit fully to their run. The gun captain nods, signals to his crew, and places his hand on the crank. Cartridges rattle as they settle deeper into the hopper. The first few infantry volleys crack out along the forward edge of the camp, but the riders keep coming, spreading slightly, intent on getting close enough to stampede the loose animals away from the guards. The distance closes quickly. Men near the herd can now see paint on horses and shields, single raven feathers, brass tacks glinting on rifle stocks. Some of the shots from the leading riders reach the herd guards, kicking up dirt near their feet and snapping through tufts of grass. The animals bunch and wheel, ears back, eyes rolling, as the noise and movement wash over them. The herd is still just far enough from the wagons that a successful scare could send them fleeing across open country, where mounted attackers might cut out many head. Before that happens, Stanley drops his hand and the gun captain begins to turn the crank. At first, the sound is uneven as the mechanism starts. Then it settles into a hard, continuous beat that rolls across the basin like a long drum line. Muzzle flashes stitch along the front of the barrels and emptied brass flies in a stream onto the ground beside the carriage. Instead of scattered rifle cracks, the air fills with a dense roar as bullets cut into the open space between the camp and the oncoming ponies. Dust leaps in sheets along the path of the rounds, and bits of sod and grass whip into the air. The effect on the riders is immediate. They had expected intermittent volleys with pauses between, a pattern that leaves gaps in which fast horses can cross. Instead, they meet a band of constant fire that moves with them as the crew adjusts the aim. Several ponies stumble as bullets strike legs or shoulders, throwing their riders forward into the dust. Others rear and try to wheel away as the ground in front of them erupts. The charge loses its shape within seconds as men fight to control wounded animals or throw themselves toward the nearest cover. On the ridges, other Lakota watch the scene unfold. From that height, they can see the steady motion of the man turning the crank, the bright flicker at the muzzle ends, and the way the riders below suddenly scatter, not in the usual orderly retreat but in broken lines bent sideways and backward. They hear the unbroken rattle instead of the expected rise and fall of individual rifle shots. They see horses crumple and men crawl away from open ground that only moments before looked clear and inviting. No one on those ridges mistakes this noise and pattern for anything they have heard in prior fights with regular soldiers. When the riders pull back, the gun crew eases off the crank and the roar dies into scattered echoes. Smoke hangs low over the forward edge of the camp, mingling with dust and the smell of hot metal. The herd is now bunched tight near the wagons, guards talking softly to calm the animals while other soldiers move to reinforce them. Infantrymen along the northern edge of the line keep their rifles at the ready, watching for any second effort. Medics head out with stretchers toward where a few men from the herd guard lie wounded by the first shots of the attack. Stanley rides along that edge, speaking to officers and men, making sure the line holds firm. He pauses by the Gatling, looks at the pile of empties at its feet and then at the riders who now gather again on the far ridges. There is satisfaction in the fact that the herd remains in camp and the wagons have not been overrun, but there is no cheering. Everyone can see bodies on the ground beyond the nearest tufts of grass, both men and animals. The scene makes clear what the gun can do in open country when a group commits itself to a direct run toward a protected point. Word of the incident moves quickly through both camps on that plain. In the soldiers' bivouac, men talk about how fast the gun ran, how different the sound felt in the chest compared with ordinary volleys, how clearly they saw the change in the attackers' movement once the fire reached them. Some compare it to the heavy fire along fieldworks they remember from the Civil War, except concentrated along a narrower front and driven by one crew instead of many companies. Others focus on the practical result, which is that the herd stayed where it needed to stay and the wagons were not cut out. They understand that on future marches the gun will be positioned with even more attention to likely approaches used by bold riders. Among the Lakota, the story told around fires over the following nights emphasizes different details. Men who were on the ridge described the constant line of flashes and the way the ground itself seemed to whip and jump in front of the oncoming horses. Those who tried to ride in speak of feeling bullets strike all around them, not in isolated clusters, but as an unbroken pattern that left no easy opening. They say that turning away felt less like retreat and more like the only path that did not lead straight into a wall of iron. Older warriors listen carefully and begin to talk about changing their own methods when facing columns that bring such guns into the field. The march continues and Stanley's column reaches the Yellowstone with its survey party intact. The engineers take their measurements along the riverbanks, select crossings, and sketch out possible grades for the future track. All the while, soldiers hold a perimeter around them, rifles ready, guns sighted to cover likely avenues of approach across the meadows and low hills. There are more sightings of distant riders, a few sharp exchanges of fire with small bands testing the edges of the escort, but no second attempt at a close run on the herd. The memory of what happened at that first basin hangs in the air around both the batteries and the scouts watching from far slopes. When the expedition finally turns back toward Fort Rice, the men are thinner, their uniforms stained and worn from weeks of hard work and bad weather. But the column remains intact. On the return march, the battery guns roll in the same central positions they held on the way out, now carrying with them not just potential but a record of what they have already done. Stanley writes in his reports about the usefulness of the guns in protecting the vulnerable parts of his column, and about the effect of their fire on a determined mounted group. He notes that with a few such weapons, a column can hold off attacks that would otherwise force it to abandon stock or even break apart under pressure. Those reports go back east along with maps and survey notes, entering official files that quietly record how rapid fire guns have begun to shape the conduct of both escorts and attackers along the Yellowstone. July 2, 1874. Dawnlight runs along the ridge above Fort Abraham Lincoln while fog lifts from the Missouri River flats, leaving wet streaks on the grass and damp on the rough plank walkways between the post buildings. Outside the walls, a sprawling camp stretches south across the open ground, rows of white canvas tents, cook fires burning low, picket lines crowded with horses, mules, and a small herd of cattle that will walk with the command. 10 companies of the 7th Cavalry stand ready to move, their horses already saddled, carbines checked, saddlebags loaded with rations and spare clothing for weeks away from the post. Near the main road, 3 squat artillery carriages sit in line, each mounting a multi-barrel gun with its metal cluster shining dully under a light coat of oil, and a heavier Rodman cannon stands just beyond them with its muzzle raised slightly toward the hills. The fort's band tunes instruments near the gate, their uniforms brushed and straight in contrast to the trail-worn gear of the men who will ride out. Along the gallery railings of the officers' quarters, women in plain dresses and shawls stand together, watching the camp and talking in low tones. Elizabeth Custer leans lightly against a post, eyes on the line of tents and the tall figure moving among the companies below. She has watched her husband leave posts before, but the size of this column and the direction of its march unsettle her more than most past departures. Beyond the far edge of the camp, the low outline of the Black Hills stands dark against the western sky. Land marked on paper as reserved for Lakota people, yet about to feel the weight of a heavily armed United States expedition. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rides through the assembled companies on a bright horse. Hat tipped forward, long hair brushed straight down his shoulders, field glasses hanging from his shoulder strap. He moves at a walk so he can look closely at each troop, checking that ammunition belts sit right, that carbines are lashed properly to saddles, that no man carries more than ordered. He passes the Arikara scouts as well, about 60 mounted men in mixed clothing, some in army coats and hats, others in beaded shirts and leggings, all with weapons and gear arranged according to their own habits. Their faces are intent, and their eyes go off into the distant hills where Lakota camps may lie beyond the next line of ridges. Some of them lost relatives when a Lakota force struck the Arikara village at Like a Fishhook only weeks earlier, and they ride today with a private reason to see this expedition succeed in forcing a permanent United States presence into the hills. The 3 Gatling guns assigned to the march wait in a neat line near the road, mounted on specially built wheeled carriages that sit lower than the Rodman's field carriage. Each has its barrels covered by a canvas wrap that will be peeled back once the column is on the move, and each carriage carries a small chest bolted near the trail for tools and spares. Artillerymen detailed from the post battery stand by their pieces, sleeves rolled, hands already showing stains from oil and powder around their nails. They have spent weeks on a dusty lot behind the fort learning to raise and lower the barrels with a crank to feed metallic cartridges from prepared boxes into the hopper, to turn the main handle at a controlled speed that keeps the mechanism from outrunning the supply of rounds. The men know the official rate of fire given in the manuals and the faster rate they can reach if ordered, and they understand that the guns will be expected to cover vulnerable points in the line whenever the column crosses confined ground. Near 8 o'clock, a bugle signal cuts across the camp and movement begins in sequence marked by shouted orders and the creak of leather under strain. The scouts mount and ride ahead under their officer, followed by the 1st Cavalry companies that will act as advance guard. Behind them come the covered wagons, more than 100 in all. Canvas stretched tight over bows, each loaded with rations, forage, tents, tools, mining gear, and equipment for the surveyors who will test soils and map terrain. The cattle herd moves with its own guard, kept to one side of the main route, while spare horses and pack mules fill the gaps between wagon groups. The artillery detachment moves in the center portion of the column, the Rodman cannon slightly forward, the 3 Gatlings spaced so that no single mishap or attack can remove them all at once. As the long line passes through the open gate, the band strikes up "The Girl I Left Behind Me," and the tune runs over the rattle of harness chains and the drumming of hooves on packed earth. Women on the porches wave handkerchiefs and call out brief farewells that get lost in the sound of movement. Custer rides near the head of the main body, turning now and then to look back at the full length of the column, counting wagons and troop elements by habit, even though the lists have been checked many times. He knows that the expedition's task is to locate a site for a future fort, to explore a route south, and to report on the presence of valuable mineral deposits in the Black Hills. He also knows that every movement into that country will be watched by Lakota people who consider the hills sacred and whose treaty with the United States promised that no such intrusion would occur. On ridges beyond the post's cultivated fields, Lakota riders sit their horses and watch the column take shape. They have seen many different groups leave Fort Abraham Lincoln since it was established, from small patrols that move quickly to larger formations that plod under heavy loads. This gathering of more than 1,000 men, wagons, cattle, artillery, and the new multi-barrel guns is different in scope. Through field glasses taken in earlier campaigns or acquired through trade. Some of the watchers study the odd carriages with short clustered barrels that ride surrounded by soldiers. They talk quietly about weapons that can fire again and again without the long pause to reload, and about what such guns might mean if the soldiers who own them decide to build a fort deep in the hills. Once the last wagons leave the Fort Abraham Lincoln grounds, the column settles into a marching rhythm on the open prairie. Dust rises under every hoof and wheel, trailing behind the expedition in a pale cloud that hangs over the route. The advance guard keeps a steady distance ahead, checking each rise and draw for sign, while flankers ride on either side, watching for any mounted group that might try to approach unseen. The Gatlings roll on hard-packed tracks near the middle of the wagon line, their crews walking alongside when the ground is gentle and climbing onto the carriages when the path grows rough. Ammunition wagons assigned specifically to feed those guns travel nearby, each packed with boxes of cartridges that represent many thousands of shots if brought to bear in a single action. Camps along the way follow a pattern that the Army has honed over years of campaigns in open country. When evening comes, wagons pull into a loose rectangle or oval around a central area where kitchens and headquarters tents will stand. Cavalry picket lines are set beyond the wagons so the horses can graze under watch in the fading light, while the cattle herd is drawn in close enough to guard yet far enough to avoid fouling the main camp. The artillery pieces, both the Rodman and the Gatlings, are parked in places where they can be moved quickly to face any side of the camp if an alarm sounds. Arikara scouts hold their own fires at the edges of the bivouac, singing softly and adjusting gear in preparation for the next day's ride into ground that grows more broken as they near the high country. Custer keeps strict control over how and when weapons are discharged. He does not allow men to fire at game near the line or waste powder on target practice that might send wrong signals to distant observers. He has seen how frivolous firing can encourage careless habits, and how a sudden, unplanned volley can start rumors of an attack where none exists. The Gatling crews follow this same rule. They do not turn the cranks during camp drills unless specifically ordered, and they keep the guns covered when not in use. If the weapons are brought into action, it will be in response to a clear threat, not to satisfy curiosity or impress visitors. As the column pushes deeper into the interior, the outline of the Black Hills rises more sharply each day. What had been a low smudge at the horizon becomes a wall of dark slopes and rock spires with wooded draws cutting down into the surrounding plains. The air grows cooler in the evenings, and the scent of pine begins to mix with the smell of dust and animals when the wind shifts from the west. Scouts report occasional sign of small camps near streams, abandoned fire pits, and pony tracks that cross likely routes toward the interior. Each time such sign is found, Custer orders extra care in forming the night camp and adjusts the positions of his guns to cover likely approaches. When the expedition reaches the northern approaches to the hills, Custer keeps his main body together rather than advancing in scattered detachments. The Rodman cannon is placed where its shell can reach higher slopes if needed, while the Gatlings are stationed closer to the parts of the line that will move through narrow valleys and timbered ravines. Surveyors begin to work in earnest now. laying chains, taking compass readings, and recording elevations that will later guide decisions about road and rail routes. Cavalry pickets ride through stands of trees where visibility shrinks to a few dozen yards, scanning for any sign of movement among the trunks. The Gatling crews study each choke point and imagine where their fields of fire would run if ordered to cover the retreat of a pinned patrol or to protect the wagons while engineers complete their observations. On one stretch of the march, Arikara scouts return with news of a small Lakota camp ahead, 5 lodges near a creek in a clearing surrounded by timber. They speak of seeing women and children as well as a few adult men, and they request permission to ride closer with their own war paint and songs, carrying grief for the attack on their village into a direct strike. Custer listens but refuses their request, instructing them that the expedition will not start a fight where none yet exists. He orders the main column to detour enough to avoid direct contact while maintaining its general direction toward the interior. The Gatlings remain with the wagons, still hooded, still silent, yet their very presence makes it clear that if the camp chooses to fire first, the answer available to the soldiers will be more intense than any response these hills have seen before. Gold traces begin to appear in pans along streams as the civilian miners attach to the expedition test promising gravel bars. At a site along French Creek, one prospector works a pan of sand and small stones until tiny specks of metal flash at the bottom. The result is shown to officers and confirmed by repeated tests that suggest steady returns for a man who spends whole days working such deposits. These findings are recorded in Custer's reports, and he sends couriers back toward established telegraph points with messages that note the presence of gold in the Black Hills. Though no shot has yet been fired from a Gatling barrel on this expedition, the guns stand near the camp perimeter each night while these tests are made, guarding an activity whose consequences will pour miners, speculators, and future troops into the region. At a large meadow that the expedition names Custer Park, the column establishes a semi-permanent camp from which smaller parties ride out to explore and map. Tents stand in orderly rows, horse lines are extended under stands of trees, and small gardens of trampled grass show where wagons have ground their wheels into the soil. The Rodman and the Gatlings are sighted so they can cover all the main approaches to this base, their crews assigned regular watches instead of constant motion. From this position, the expedition's leaders examine potential sites for a permanent fort, ground high enough to see in all directions, close to water, and open enough to allow fields of fire for artillery and machine gun positions. The men know that if such a post is built, future Lakota war parties will have to consider both cannon and Gatlings in any plan to ride directly against its walls. In the Lakota camps beyond the hills, messengers carry reports about what has been seen and heard. They speak of a line of white tents and wagons that runs farther than a man can see from a single ridge, of herds of cattle brought into the hills as walking food, of heavy guns that can throw shot, and of smaller machines that promise a ceaseless storm of bullets when turned toward a target. They tell how the expedition moves cautiously but with confidence, staying together, avoiding reckless splits into small groups that could be cut off. They recount how the soldiers show by their bearing that they expect to remain in or near this country after the expedition, either through a fort or through mining camps that the army will feel bound to protect. In many of these retellings, the mention of the multi-barrel guns carries a particular weight, because it signals that future fights near any new post will not resemble older engagements fought against single-shot rifle lines. By late August, with maps drawn, notes taken, and enough observations gathered to satisfy the expedition's official tasks, Custer orders the column to turn back toward Fort Abraham Lincoln. The route out of the hills follows some of the same valleys and ridges used on the way in, now more familiar but still watched by unseen eyes. The Gatlings roll along with scuffed wheels and dulled paint, their crews thinner but more confident in their ability to bring the guns into action quickly if pressed. No large Lakota force has chosen to ride straight into the expedition's path, yet the tension that has rested over every camp and every sharp bend in the trail has left its mark on men and animals alike. The absence of a pitched battle does not erase the meaning of what has happened. A sizable United States column with machine guns has entered treaty-protected land, tested it, reported on its resources, and left knowing how to return. On the final approach to Fort Abraham Lincoln at the end of August, infantry detachments and families line the bluff to watch the column come home. The band plays another marching tune as the first riders appear, uniforms stained, horses thinner, wagons bearing the dust of hundreds of miles. Behind the cavalry and the scouts, the artillery detachment rides in with the Rodman and the 3 Gatlings, which now seem part of the normal array of Army equipment rather than strange novelties. Reports will state that only 1 casualty was suffered on the expedition, that no major fight occurred, and that the mission achieved its aims. In the months and years that follow, however, the notes about gold, fort sites, and the presence of Gatling guns on that march into the Black Hills will shape the decisions that lead to permanent posts and to later wars in which brave charges against United States positions must face weapons built to fire without pause. August 30, 1874. Gray light spreads across the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, touching low ridges, wind-carved draws, and scattered clumps of scrub along a bend of the Red River. The air feels dry even before the sun rises, and a fine dust lies over the ground, ready to lift at the slightest movement. In a shallow valley north of the river, a line of canvas-topped wagons stands halted, tongues down, teams blowing hard after a long march. Around them, soldiers of the United States Army move with stiff, tired steps, tightening saddle cinches, refilling canteens from muddy pools, and adjusting cartridge belts that ride low on sweat-darkened blouses. Colonel Nelson Miles sits his horse near the edge of a low rise and studies the country ahead through field glasses. His column has been in the field for weeks, driving south and west across the staked plains in search of Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Comanche bands that still camp and hunt away from the reservations. The ground behind his men shows days of hard pursuit, with dead animals left along the line of march and men drawn thin from short rations and broken sleep. Yet the column still holds a solid core of infantry, cavalry detachments, Indian scouts, 2 small howitzers, and 2 Gatling guns mounted on traveling carriages. The scouts who rode in before dawn told him that a large Cheyenne village lay ahead along the crooked course of the river, and that warriors had watched his fires through the night from the shelter of nearby bluffs. The sun pushes clear of the horizon and heat begins to press down on the basin. Miles gives the order to move, and the column stretches out again. Cavalry and scouts in front, infantry companies and wagons following on the narrow track between broken ridges. The 2 Gatlings roll near the middle of the formation, flanked by infantrymen whose faces are streaked with dust and sweat. Their crews walk with the carriages, hands resting on wheel rims and trail handles, glancing often at the surrounding hills. Each crew has rehearsed the same sequence so many times that every movement feels automatic. Unlimber the carriage, swing it into position, chock the wheels, open ammunition boxes, feed the hopper, and then turn the crank until ordered to stop. Ahead of the main body, Cheyenne scouts watch from the tops of buttes and from the mouths of side canyons. They see the line of wagons and mounted men winding along the valley floor, and they count more soldiers in this column than in many earlier patrols. They notice the 2 short-wheeled carriages with clustered barrels that move with unusual attention from the soldiers around them. For days they have tested the column's edges with long-range shots and feints, striking at stragglers and stock, then fading back before the main body could close. Now, With word that the village lies close by, they carry messages to war leaders who weigh whether to strike hard at this force before it reaches the lodges. Late morning, the advance scouts of Miles's column approach a section of country where the valley narrows between high bluffs. The trail drops into a shallow trough with broken ground on either side, and a low ridge rises ahead like a lip across the route. The land here gives mounted warriors cover on the heights and offers them a clear run down into the throat of the column if they choose to come. Miles sends skirmishers forward and orders the main body to compress, tightening the distance between wagons and companies so that no gap opens between the parts of the escort. He keeps the Gatlings close to him near the center, ready to move them toward any side that suddenly fills with riders. The first sign of the coming clash is not a shot, but a distant rising sound like many horses hitting a gallop on hard ground. Scouts on the flank shout and point toward a high rim of earth to the left, where dark specks appear against the pale sky. Within moments, the specks resolve into mounted warriors, ranks of Cheyenne riders cresting the ridge and pouring down the slope in a broad front. Bright shirts, painted faces, and feathered hair ornaments flash in the sunlight as they descend. Lances held upright, rifles laid across saddle bows, voices raised in sharp cries that reach the soldiers below. At the same time, other riders show on the right and farther along the rim, moving fast enough that the noise of hooves becomes a steady, hard pounding under the calls and shouts. Miles sees the movement and reacts at once. He signals his staff, points to a small knoll near the wagons, and orders the Gatlings unlimbered there to cover the space between the bluffs and the train. Infantry companies are thrown out into a rough arc, kneeling and prone, rifles aimed at the approaching slope. Cavalrymen dismount and run their horses to the relative shelter of a shallow wash, then hurry forward on foot to thicken the line. The howitzers are dragged into position a little behind the infantry, their crews working fast to ready shell and case shot. Above all, the success of this hurried arrangement depends on how quickly the machine guns can be made to fire. Artillerymen rush to the first Gatling, swing the trail around toward the oncoming riders, and jam rocks under the wheels. The protective covers on the barrel cluster are yanked away and tossed aside. Ammunition boxes are cracked open and metallic cartridges lifted out in double handfuls, their brass cases already hot to the touch from the sun. One crewman flips back the hopper lid and pours the rounds in, stacking them to the brim while another checks the feed mechanism with a quick touch. The gun captain takes his place behind the crank, eyes fixed not on the weapon but on the narrowing gap between the cavalry line and the men riding toward it. The Cheyenne charge grows thicker as more riders join from the flanks. Men at the front of the wave lean low over their horses' necks, using the animals' bodies as partial shields while they fire occasional shots toward the kneeling soldiers below. Others carry lances and coup-sticks, intending to close the distance and strike men who fall or who break from the line. They have faced soldiers with rifles and even with small cannon before, and they have broken weaker columns by moving faster than the soldiers could load and fire. From their saddles, the gray and blue coats look small and scattered, and the wagons behind them look vulnerable if the line bends. At a sharp word from Miles, the gun captain grips the crank handle and begins to turn. The first rotation is slow, the gun coughing single shots as the mechanism cycles. Then the captain settles into a firm, even motion, and the weapon answers with a continuous stream of reports that blend so closely that gaps between them are hard to hear. Empty brass flies from the side of the frame and bounces in a growing pile at the carriage's feet. Powder smoke pours forward and downwind, thickening quickly around the barrel cluster and drifting toward the charging riders. Bullets from the machine gun reach the Cheyenne line faster than many of the men in that line can fire a second shot. The first ranks of horses begin to take hits in the chest, neck, and legs, Animals rear, twist, and topple, throwing riders sideways or forward into the dust. Some warriors try to stand and run on foot, only to find the ground in front of them torn by further impacts. Others haul on their reins, trying to swing their mounts away from the hottest part of the fire, only to crowd into the horses next to them and add to the confusion. Infantry along the arc fire in volleys whenever officers shout the order, adding more bullets to the forward cone of fire. The second Gatling, now in place to cover a slightly different angle, begins to operate as well, its own crew matching the rhythm of the first. The combined output creates a dense pattern of impacts out ahead of the soldiers, reaching into the very paths the riders need to use if they hope to break into the line. The howitzers join in with shell that bursts over the heads of those farther back on the slopes, throwing fragments among horses and men still forming for the charge. In a matter of minutes, the open ground between the bluffs and the wagons becomes a field of fallen animals, scattered riders and dust clouds kicked up by sudden, uncontrolled movement. From within the Cheyenne ranks, the change in the fight is brutal and clear. Warriors who expected to count the time between rifle volleys find that there is no pause long enough to allow a measured rush. The sound in their ears is not the familiar pattern of shots with spaces between, but a harsh, rapid rattle that does not stop while they are within range. Men who try to swing wide find that the fire follows them as the gun crews adjust the traverse by small degrees. The distance that once could be crossed in a few heartbeats on a fast horse now feels longer because each yard is filled with the impact of new rounds. Those farther back on the ridge watch as the leading riders slow, stumble, and fall away. They see horses rear in panic and pitch forward. They see riders roll on the ground, some trying to get back to their feet, others lying still. Smoke lies in streaks and sheets, hiding parts of the field for a moment and then clearing as the wind shifts, revealing new figures on the ground. The decision to continue the charge becomes impossible to justify for those who still sit on uninjured mounts high on the ridge. Gradually, the wave of riders flattens. Small groups break off from the front, turning their horses to run back toward the cover of the bluffs. Others follow in ones and twos, glancing over their shoulders at the line of soldiers and the steady flicker of the Gatling muzzles. The firing from the machine slows as the gun captains ease their arms when clear targets pull away, then stops on command while the crews check the mechanisms and the remaining ammunition. Infantrymen hold their rifles ready but do not pursue immediately into the beaten ground, wary of feigned retreats and of the effect that the heat and smoke already have on their own senses. After the charge has fully broken, a heavy silence settles over the valley except for the ragged breathing of men and animals. The area in front of the wagons is littered with bodies of horses and scattered equipment, broken lances, fallen rifles, shields, and personal belongings. Wounded animals thrash or lie still, and medics move forward carefully, checking fallen soldiers and dragging the living back toward the wagons. Cheyenne dead and wounded lie intermixed with dead mounts, and no one close to the scene mistakes what the sustained fire from the machine guns has done. The sharp metallic smell of hot barrels mixes with the thicker smell of blood and dust. Miles rides along the line, face set, asking brief questions of officers and sergeants. He wants to know how many rounds the Gatling crews expended, how the mechanisms held up under continuous operation, and how quickly they were able to bring the guns into action from march order. The answers are precise because the men have been counting even under stress. They have seen barrels heat to a point where shimmering air wraps them. Yet the rotating cluster has allowed them to keep firing while individual tubes cool slightly between shots. The colonel makes mental notes that will later appear in formal reports, linking the survival of his forward train and stock to the presence of those guns on the knoll. On the heights, Cheyenne leaders gather those who have escaped the fire and pull back toward their village. They count who is missing and who lies burned and torn on the plain below. Some men argue that the charge did not carry far enough, that a more sudden rush might have reached the wagons. Others point out that the line of bullets seemed to adjust with every movement, that there was no natural pause in which a rider could push through and find cover. In those exchanges, the realization settles that any direct massed ride into the teeth of such guns will produce losses that no village can bear for long. As the day lengthens, the army column moves forward with more caution, but also with a new sense of what its weapons can do. Miles sends skirmishers and scouts ahead to feel out the ground between the site of the broken charge and the reported location of the Cheyenne camp. When they finally reach the abandoned village later, they find lodges struck in haste, food and belongings left behind, and evidence of many families who have chosen flight over further contact. The destruction of the camp's stores, combined with the loss of horses under the machine gun fire, will press those people hard when winter comes. Report writers in the army will later describe the outcome in plain terms, counting captured livestock, destroyed property, and the number of warriors estimated to have fallen in front of the guns. For soldiers in the ranks, the memory stays fixed as a picture rather than a list. They remember the sight of the slope covered with riders at full speed, the instant when the crank first began to move, and the change in the scene once the fire reached full strength. They remember how quickly the open ground emptied of moving horses and how slowly the sound of shots faded from their ears afterward. Gatling crews recall the strain in their arms, the heat on their faces, and the feeling that the weapon under their hands had altered the balance between attackers and defenders in a way that single-shot rifles never could. Infantrymen and cavalry troopers talk quietly by campfires about how it would have looked if the guns had not been there, imagining a broken line and scattered wagons instead of a held position. Among the Cheyenne, stories of the fight travel far beyond the immediate circle of survivors. Men who were in the charge describe a continuous stream of bullets that chewed into the earth and into ranks of horses faster than any warrior could ride through. They recall how the sound did not rise and fall like the usual exchange of fire, but remained steady as long as the man at the crank kept moving his arm. They speak of watching brothers, cousins, and respected leaders fall in places where, in earlier years, they might have expected to reach the soldiers and strike them at close quarters. These accounts shape later councils in which war leaders advise younger men to avoid large, open charges against positions marked by such weapons. Hit-and-run raids, small night attacks, and efforts to cut stock away from posts and columns begin to make more sense than broad daylight rushes into visible lines. The Red River fight, where the machine guns first tore apart a major Cheyenne charge, becomes one of several moments during that hard campaign when the new weapons show what they can do on the open plains. The result is not only a tactical victory in a single valley, but a shift in how both sides think about the risks of direct assaults on United States forces. For the Army, the lesson is that a relatively small number of men at the cranks can hold key points in a way that once required many more rifles in line. For the warriors who ride out from villages along the Red River and beyond, the lesson is that courage and speed alone will no longer carry a charge through concentrated fire. That understanding will travel with them toward the next season's confrontations near the forts and along the river crossings that the Army now plans to hold with machine guns as well as rifles and cannon. April 5, 1875. Low clouds drift over the valley of the North Canadian River, and the buildings of Fort Reno stand on the rise above the water, their raw lumber walls and barracks roofs still new against the pale grass. Inside the post, morning routine moves forward in the usual pattern, with infantry companies drilling on the parade ground, cavalry troopers grooming horses in the corrals, and smoke rising from the kitchens behind the barracks. Beyond the walls, a Cheyenne village stands in the bottomland, clusters of teepees near cottonwoods that lean over the river. Men, women, and children move between the lodges and the fort, some working under Army contracts, others visiting relatives confined inside the post, while officers balance the tasks of keeping order and preparing to send selected prisoners east for confinement. Among the men called into the fort that morning is Black Horse, a Cheyenne who has resisted the tightening grip of the reservation system and now faces removal as a supposed leader in the fighting that marked the Red River campaigns. He walks between soldiers toward the guardhouse, hands free for the moment, dark coat hanging open over his shirt, hair bound back with strips of cloth. Around him, enlisted men watch with mixed expressions, some curious, some hostile, some indifferent after months of frontier duty. An interpreter and an officer step ahead to explain that he will be bound and held for transport with other designated prisoners. The words carry across the yard as a small group of Cheyenne onlookers, mostly relatives and friends, cluster near the gate to see what happens next. At the guardhouse door, a pair of soldiers move to place iron shackles on Black Horse's wrists and ankles. The steel cuffs are cold and bright in the gray light, and the sound of chain links scraping against themselves cuts through the murmur of voices in the yard. When the first band closes around his wrist, Black Horse stiffens. He has entered the post under a flag of truce and now understands that he is to be taken away from his family and sent far beyond the plains where he has always lived. In a sudden movement, he twists, throws his shoulder past the nearest soldier and breaks free of the hands reaching to grab him. For an instant, the yard freezes. Then Black Horse runs, boots pounding the hard ground as he drives toward the gate and the open space beyond, eyes fixed on the path that leads down the slope toward the Cheyenne camp. Shouts erupt from the guard detail and a command rings out to halt. When he does not stop, a rifle shot cracks from the sentry line near the gate. The bullet strikes him as he runs and he stumbles, pitches forward and falls in the dirt just short of the road that drops toward the river. Cheyenne men at the gate see him go down. Several rush forward only to be shoved back by soldiers whose faces now show open alarm. Anger runs through the small crowd like a sudden current. The body of Black Horse lies exposed on the bare ground in full view of his people, and no one is allowed close enough to lift him or cover him. Men turn from the gate and stride rapidly down the slope toward the village, voices carrying downhill as they call out names and instructions. In the Cheyenne camp, the news spreads in moments. Black Horse has been shot inside the fort while under talk of peace, and his body lies in the yard under the guns. Men who once fought Miles's column on the plains and who surrendered when the campaigns ended, now stand on soil where they are supposed to live under guard and rations. Yet the killing shows that they are still subject to sudden decisions from officers within the walls. Old grief from the Red River fighting mixes with this new insult. Younger men look toward the low sand hills north of the fort where months earlier weapons had been cached in case trust in the army failed. Groups move quickly toward that ground. They run and ride across the open bottomland, skirting the fort's grazing herds, eyes on the rounded mounds of sand and scrub that stand a short distance from the walls. At the base of those hills, hands dig into loose soil and uncover rifles wrapped in cloth, extra ammunition, and a few old pistols. Some men scramble higher, using the natural folds of the sand to find shallow hollows. Others begin to scoop out rifle pits with knives, hands, and makeshift tools, deepening them just enough to lie below the crest and still see the fort's buildings above the intervening ground. From inside the post, the officers watch this movement with rising concern. They know that Cheyenne families were allowed to camp under the promise that those chosen for imprisonment would come in peacefully. Now, within minutes of the shooting at the gate, armed men are establishing positions in the hills within rifle range of the walls. The post commander orders the long roll beaten on the drum, calling the garrison to arms. Infantrymen grab rifles and fall in on the parade ground, cavalry troopers run for the corrals, and artillery soldiers head for their guns. Fort Reno holds a Gatling gun among its armament, a multi-barrel piece that has been drilled but never used in earnest against men this close to the palisade. It sits on its carriage in a low earthwork near one angle of the fort, with its muzzles aimed toward the open ground between the walls and the sandhills. Under shouted orders, the crew runs to the position, pulls off the canvas cover, checks the breech mechanism, and begins hauling ammunition boxes into reach. While they work, other soldiers drag a small field piece into place beside the machine gun, positioning it so that shell and case shot can reach the edges of the hills if necessary. The fort that greeted Cheyenne visitors with open gates at sunrise is now shifting into a siege posture by mid-morning. The first shots from the sandhills are sporadic. Rifles crack from shallow pits and from behind clumps of brush, bullets whining over the open ground and striking the walls and roofs of the fort with sharp, flat sounds. Splinters fly from logs along the parapet, and one shot punches through a barracks window, lodging in a bunk frame. Soldiers unused to taking fire at such close range while still inside the post duck by reflex, then rise to return shots from loopholes and firing steps along the inner side of the wall. The range is close enough that men on both sides can see the movements of individual figures when the smoke thins. The fort commander orders a troop of cavalry to mount and drive the Cheyenne away from their new positions before they can strengthen them. The troopers swing into saddles, carbines slung, sabers left behind, and file out through the gate at a trot. They form into a loose line once clear of the walls and angle toward the hills, intending to reach the base, dismount, and fight forward on foot. From the pits, Cheyenne marksmen watch them come, waiting until the riders close to a distance where lead and distance fall more in their favor. When the line reaches the lower slopes, a concentrated volley erupts from the sandhills. Horses scream and rear as bullets hit. Several animals drop, and at least one trooper pitches sideways out of the saddle and lies still. Others leap free of their mounts and dive for what little cover the uneven ground offers. The planned push up the slope collapses into separate knots of men trying to return fire while lying in sparse grass and sand. Under a rain of further shots, the cavalry officers shout the order to fall back. The troopers drag their wounded where they can, mount where possible, and retreat toward the fort, leaving one man dead on the hillside as they pull away. The failure of that attempt changes the shape of the fight. Cheyenne riflemen now hold prepared positions that overlook the approaches to the fort, and they have already shown that a mounted rush under direct fire will not easily dislodge them. If they remain, they can continue to shoot at any soldier who crosses the open space between the walls and the river, threaten the grazing herds, and keep the fort under constant harassment. Inside, officers and non-commissioned men understand that a prolonged standoff so close to the post will embolden other groups and undermine the authority of the garrison. The remaining solution is to use the weapons designed for exactly this kind of confrontation across bare ground. The order goes out to bring the Gatling fully into action. Artillerymen swing the carriage so that the cluster of barrels points directly toward the nearest ridge of sand and scrub where rifle smoke appears. Rough steps cut into the earthwork allow the crew to stand high enough to see the land between the fort and the pits. Metallic cartridges are poured into the hopper until they stack up near the top, ready to drop into the chambers as the breech rotates. The gun captain takes his position behind the crank, jaw clenched, eyes following the faint movement of heads and shoulders behind the sand. A brief lull settles over the field as each side adjusts. Then the commander gives the signal, and the first bursts from the Gatling tear across the valley. The initial turns of the crank send out a few measured shots while the mechanism finds its rhythm. The captain increases his speed, and the separate reports merge into a harsh, rapid sequence that does not leave time between them for any careful counting. Empty brass cases spill from the gun's side and clatter down into a growing layer at the base of the parapet, the metal hot enough that men handle it with boots rather than bare hands. Across the open space, the bullets strike the sandhills in thick patterns. Sand leaps into the air in narrow streams where the rounds hit, and small bushes shred under the impacts. Where a Cheyenne rifleman had moments earlier rested his barrel on the lip of a pit, the edge now crumbles under repeated hits. Men duck lower, pressing themselves against the rear walls of their shallow trenches. Any movement above the crest draws fresh attention from the crew, who adjust the traverse by small degrees to keep the fire walking back and forth across likely positions. The sound inside the fort is intense. Infantrymen along the wall feel the vibration of the firing run through the timbers under their feet. The air fills with smoke that carries the bitter smell of powder, drifting across the parade ground and into the officers' quarters as the barrels continue to rotate. The field piece beside the Gatling adds its own contribution, lobbing shells that burst on the flanks of the sandhills, sending fragments and rocks into the side slopes where secondary pits may lie. Communication becomes a matter of shouts and gestures because normal speech cannot be heard over the combined noise. In the rifle pits, the experience is different but no less overwhelming. Cheyenne men crouch low, pressed against the back walls of their shallow shelters while sand spills down from the edges above their heads. Those who try to lift their rifles for a shot find that leaning into the open for even a short moment invites a stream of rounds that slice into the lip of the pit and the ground around it. A few manage scattered fire toward the fort, but the volume of bullets coming in makes any sustained aim difficult. Splinters of rock and shards of metal from the nearby shell bursts add to the danger, cutting into exposed skin and driving men to shield their faces with their forearms. Time stretches under this pressure. The Gatling crew keeps turning the crank, pausing only long enough to let a loader pour fresh cartridges into the hopper. Sweat runs down their faces and necks despite the relatively cool air of early spring, and their arms ache from the repetitive motion, but they do not slacken their pace. The barrels grow hot enough that waves of heated air shimmer just in front of the muzzles. Between bursts, crewmen pour water over parts of the mechanism and wipe away residue to keep the action from binding. After repeated strings of fire, the gun captain finally eases the crank, letting the weapon wind down. For a few moments, the valley lies under a strange quiet, with only the groans of wounded and the low murmur of voices along the wall breaking the stillness. Infantrymen watch the sandhills through the thinning smoke. Some pits show no movement at all. Others reveal brief glimpses of men crawling backward away from their exposed rims. A few figures can be seen dragging themselves down the far slopes, leaving trails where hands and knees mark the sand. The commander decides against sending another cavalry charge into the disturbed ground. Instead, he orders a steady rifle fire from selected positions on the wall whenever movement appears in the hills. The Gatling remains trained on the area, ready to resume if any renewed rush takes shape. Through the afternoon, the exchange settles into sporadic shots from both sides, far less intense than the earlier blasts, but still deadly whenever a man misjudges the range of an exposed shoulder or head. Inside the fort, surgeons work over the wounded troopers from the first charge, and the men hit along the parapet. As the sun dips toward the horizon, shadows lengthen across the valley. From the sandhills, Cheyenne survivors begin to pull back toward the river in small groups, using the growing darkness and the folds of the ground to conceal their movement. They carry or support wounded men where they can, leaving those beyond reach under loose coverings of sand or blankets. The village below begins to break up as families prepare to move away from the fort they no longer trust, loading what they can onto travois and ponies. Children are hushed while women gather cooking pots, bedding, and clothing in hurried sequences that leave much behind. On the fort side, guards remain at their posts through the night, eyes straining to track any shapes that shift near the vacated rifle pits. The Gatling stands silent on its platform, barrels dark in the fading light, ammunition boxes closed at its base. Its crew, exhausted, sits nearby, cleaning parts by lantern light, running oily cloth over the mechanisms that had run without pause for long periods during the day. They talk in low voices, describing to each other what they saw when the gun first opened, how men in the pits reacted, how the sand leaped where the bullets hit. None of them had ever before watched a machine pour such concentrated fire into ground that close to their own walls. By morning, the sandhills are nearly empty. A few abandoned pits remain, their bottoms scattered with cartridge cases, fragments of clothing, and dark stains that mark where men fell. From the parapet, soldiers looking out see no organized force, only quiet mounds under a pale sky and the thin line of the river beyond. The Cheyenne village that stood near the cottonwoods is already thinning as families move farther down the valley, away from the fort that showed its strength with blood and metal. Inside the post, the day's duties begin again, but the memory of the previous day's fight lingers in every face that watched the Gatling cover the open space between the stockade and the sandhills. July 1, 1877. Fog clings to the ridges above Mount Idaho as first light touches the scattered houses and the rough log stockade that holds the town's tiny garrison. On a low hill just outside the settlement, earthworks ring two new guns that do not look like the old mountain howitzers some of the volunteers remember from earlier campaigns. Each weapon has a tight ring of short barrels around a central shaft, mounted on a wheeled carriage, with a feed frame and crank at the rear. A few soldiers move quietly around them, checking bolts and oiling exposed metal before the day's orders send most of the command away from this hill and toward a Nez Perce village farther up the Clearwater country. Inside Mount Idaho, Captain Stephen Whipple stands in a cramped room that serves as headquarters, listening while an officer reads General Howard's instructions one more time. He has 2 companies of cavalry under him, well over 60 regulars, and 20 civilian volunteers who know the local trails and have their own reasons for wanting force used against non-treaty bands. The orders direct him to arrest Looking Glass and the men around him at Clear Creek, to break up the small settlement there before it can add strength to Chief Joseph's host. Reports from settlers claim that Looking Glass has been sending talk and riders to the hostile camp. Whipple, who has already seen what a small band of Nez Perce can do to a careless detachment, accepts the assignment knowing the task will pull his command into tight country where mistakes will cost lives. On the hill, one of the gunners points out the clustered barrels of the new weapons to a group of volunteers who have climbed up to look. He explains that if the order ever comes, a crew can feed metallic cartridges into the hopper and send a very large number of bullets downrange while a single man turns the crank. The volunteers exchange glances, picturing what such fire would do to a line of riders caught in the open below the hill. They hear that these machines are bound for the field once trails and bridges allow it, that Howard means to bring them into any major action against the hostiles. For now, however, Whipple knows the narrow track to Clear Creek will not take heavy carriages without slowing his march to a crawl, and the guns remain in their dirt works with a small crew while the main body rides out. Just after dawn, Companies E and L of the 1st Cavalry form up in the street, carbines slung, cartridge belts tight, horses impatient under the bit. The 20 volunteers gather in a looser knot, some with government saddles and uniforms, others with private gear, old revolvers on worn belts and rifles of mixed patterns. Whipple gives brief orders, checks the column's order of march, and rides out at the head. Behind him, the line stretches back through the town's scattered buildings and up the rising trail. From doorways and yards, settlers watch them go, some calling quiet encouragement, others silent as they think about the band of Nez Perce families that plants gardens along Clear Creek. The route climbs away from the town through timber and open patches of grass along the high wooded plateau between Mount Idaho and the Clearwater drainage. Dust rises from the horses' hooves, hanging at shoulder height in the still morning air until a breeze pushes it sideways between the trees. The command has been in the saddle much of the previous days, coming from the salmon country toward Mount Idaho, and the men move with the practiced stiffness of troops used to long rides. Scouts ride ahead to feel out the last miles to the Nez Perce camp. Some of them have hunted and traded in this region before, and they know where Clear Creek bends and where the ground offers height above the valley. On the far side of the plateau, the land begins to tilt down toward the junction of Clear Creek and the middle branch of the Clearwater. The air is cooler there, and the sound of water carries faintly up the slopes. The Nez Perce call this place Kamnica. Their lodges stand near the stream, a small crescent of teepees and framed tents with gardens scratched into the rich soil nearby. Potatoes, corn, squash, and melons grow in tended plots, and a few milk cows graze in small fenced areas near the water's edge. Looking Glass, tall and broad-shouldered, sits on a blanket near his lodge, sharing a morning meal with several men. The village has fewer than a dozen teepees this day and perhaps 20 warriors. Most of the people here are women, children, elders, and those who have chosen to stay near the reservation lands. Many follow the Washat religion, and some have gone to Kamaya for a Sunday service. Looking Glass has spoken often about avoiding war, arguing that his people will gain nothing by joining the fighting that has already broken out at Whitebird Canyon. He believes that staying where they are, farming and waiting for talk with the army, may keep them from being hunted like Joseph's band now is. Word of Howard's orders does not reach his ears directly. What he hears are rumors that the general is marching with howitzers, scouts, and even new guns that can fire continuously without pausing to reload. Stories say these weapons are mounted on wheels, with many barrels that turn under a man's hands. To a leader who has seen what a single cannon can do to men in open ground, the thought of a machine that throws out bullets as quickly as a man can crank a handle suggests that any direct charge against such a position would be hopeless. Even so, he tells his people that this little settlement should be safe, that they have done nothing to provoke a raid, and that he will speak if soldiers come. A young warrior steps out of the lodge with a piece of fried meat in his hand when he hears distant riders. He sees dust on a hill to the west, above the opposite side of Clear Creek, and shapes moving along the crest. He calls out to Looking Glass and points. Through the morning haze, mounted figures appear on the skyline, dismount, and begin to take positions along the ridge. Metal flashes where rifle barrels catch the light. On that crest, Whipple's men line out along the slope, separated from the Nez Perce camp by the creek and a few hundred yards of air. They have ridden farther than planned in the dark and rough country and have arrived after sunrise, not in the pre-dawn hours Whipple had hoped for. The village lies below them, visible but still calm, people moving between lodges and gardens, unaware of the full intentions of the force on the ridge. Whipple orders the companies to dismount and lead their horses behind the high ground, leaving them in a safer fold of the slope while the troopers move forward on foot with rifles. The volunteers, some of them already restless and keyed up, mingle along the line. Looking Glass decides that talk must come before any shot. He sends Piopeo Tolect across the creek with a message that his people are living here in peace and want to be left alone. The young man rides up the hill slowly, hands open on the reins, stopping within speaking distance of the soldiers. An interpreter with Whipple steps forward, and they trade words across the short space between them. Some of the volunteers drift closer, their expressions hard. One volunteer, already smelling of liquor this early, prods Piopeo Tholect in the ribs with the barrel of his rifle and demands in English to know whether he is Looking Glass. The interpreter hastily explains that this is a younger man, not the chief, and manages to get the rifle lowered. Piopeo Tholekt repeats the message he carries, that the camp wants peace, that they wish the soldiers to ride away and let them live where they are. The interpreter says the officer wishes to speak with Looking Glass himself, and Piopeo Tholekt turns his pony and rides back down to the creek. He tells Looking Glass what he has seen, how some of the white men seem nervous and how one nearly fired by mistake. Looking Glass weighs his options. He could ride up himself and risk being seized, or send others again, or pull his people back from the lodges and prepare to run if the soldiers do not leave. Advisors around him warn that the volunteers look reckless, that trusting them might end with a shot in the back. He decides not to ride up at once. Instead, he sends Piopeo Tholekt and another man, Calouette, back to the ridge with clearer words. Before they go, he has a small flagpole planted between his lodge and the creek, and a white cloth is raised on it. The two messengers ride again toward the soldiers, passing the fluttering cloth as they cross the stream. On the ridge, some of the men watch the flag and the riders with narrowed eyes, thinking of earlier talks that turned into ambushes on other frontiers. The same volunteer who jabbed Piopeo Tholekt earlier steps close again as the young man reins in, near the interpreter. He threatens him a second time, convinced he must be Looking Glass after all, and starts to bring his rifle up. Once more the interpreter intervenes, insisting that this is not the man they seek, and the weapon lowers. Under the morning sun, with the creek running between them and the camp, the tension along the line feels ready to snap. This time an officer agrees to go down toward the flag with a small escort. He walks beside Piopeo Tholekt and Calouette toward the white cloth, while other soldiers watch from the crest. In the village below, Nez Perce eyes follow every step, waiting to see if genuine talk will occur. The party reaches the flagpole. Voices carry faintly up the slope, but no one on the ridge can make out the words. Then, before any clear understanding is reached, a shot cracks from the line above. The bullet strikes a man in the camp in the hip, and he goes down beside a lodge, crying out. No one can say with certainty which volunteer pulled the trigger first, only that the single shot ends any chance of peaceful arrest. In the same moment, more rifles on the ridge fire, and the attack is underway. The Nez Perce in the camp react instantly. Women grab children and drag them toward the brush and the low rises beyond the lodges. Men reach for rifles stacked near lodge poles, for ammunition bags, for whatever cover they can see beyond the open flats beside the creek. Horses snort and break from picket lines, some tearing free and bolting away from the sudden noise, others collapsing as bullets strike them. Dogs bark and then vanish into the brush as more rounds hammer into the thin canvas and hides of the teepees. Looking Glass shouts for his people to get into the hills. He can see from the first volleys that the soldiers hold the ridge and will pour fire down as long as any shape remains in the open. He has no Gatling gun in his village, no heavy weapon on a hill of his own, only a few rifles in the irregular cover of the slopes. There is no time to organize a formal defense or a countercharge across open ground, not with families scattered between gardens, lodges, and the creek. He runs for the timber and rock above the camp, herding those closest to him toward the draws that lead into the higher hills. On the ridge, Whipple's troopers fire steadily into the village, aiming at figures who run between lodges or dive into the brush. The volunteers shoot as well, some methodically, others with hurried motions that throw rounds high or into the creek. No one on that crest hears the clack of a crank or the continuous roar of a machine gun. The Gatlings remain at Mount Idaho. All the same, the men here know that such weapons stand behind them, and some shout about them as they fire, promising that if these people do not yield, the army will bring guns that can shoot far faster than these carbines. The idea of the machines travels in shouted boasts, even if the metal barrels do not. In the scramble up the slopes, not everyone escapes. A woman is hit and falls while running with a child on her hip. The child is thrown aside and lies still. Elders who cannot move quickly enough huddle behind lodge poles that no longer offer any real protection as bullets punch through. One man is struck while trying to cut loose a horse that could carry more people to safety. In the confusion, it is hard for anyone to see how many lie on the ground before the remaining families reach the shelter of the higher draws. When it is clear that the camp is emptied of most visible targets, Whipple orders his men down from the ridge. They cross Clear Creek, some wading, some using narrow shallows where the water only reaches boot tops. In the village, they find pots still on fires, blankets spread on ground beds, and tools lying where they were dropped in the first rush of panic. The lodges stand half empty, possessions abandoned in haste. The troopers and volunteers begin to tear them down, searching for hidden weapons and valuables. Parties round up horses, including many fine animals bred and kept by the Nez Perce for years. By the time the work ends, they will drive away hundreds of head, stripping the people who fled into the hills of much of their mobility. Some men cut open sacks of dried food and spill their contents. Others break household goods they cannot carry. Whipple watches, jaw set, knowing that he has destroyed the camp yet failed to achieve the main objective. Looking Glass and his fighting men have slipped away into country they know better than any soldier on this field. Not a single soldier lies dead in the camp. The only blood on the ridge and among the lodges belongs to Nez Perce people and their animals. From higher up the slopes, Looking Glass and his followers watch smoke begin to rise where lodges are pulled down and fires kicked against their frames. They see troops drive their horses out of the valley. They count who has made it to the shelter of brush and rock and who has not. The taste of betrayal sits hard in the mouth of a leader who only days before argued that staying on this ground might protect his people from war. Any remaining hope that talk alone can shield them from the army's decisions dies as he studies the wreckage of his camp. Far behind this scene at Mount Idaho, the two Gatling guns remain in their works on the hill. A small crew drills with them even as news of the attack begins to move along telegraph lines and trail routes. When riders from Whipple's detachment bring the captured horses back into the town, they tell their own version of the morning. In saloons and at kitchen tables, they say the column traveled with guns that can fire many rounds without stopping, that only the roughness of the ground kept those machines from being set up above Clear Creek. The story grows in the telling, turning the unseen weapons into a constant shadow over the actions of the regulars and volunteers who went forward with rifles alone. Nez Perce, runners carry a different but connected message through the hills. They describe how soldiers came with orders to seize a chief who had not yet raised a hand against them, how talk under a white flag ended once a volunteer fired into the camp, how the Americans burned lodges and drove off stock while families scattered into the timber. They also speak of hearing that new guns stand at the posts and in the path of incoming columns. Guns with many barrels that soldiers boast can fire without pause as long as the crew can keep feeding them. Those details reached Chief Joseph's main band not many days later, along with Looking Glass himself. The man who had once argued for peace now rides into the growing host with a clear memory of burned gardens and a firm belief that any future fight must measure itself against not only rifles and howitzers but also the mechanical guns waiting along the army's lines. By the time Looking Glass's people join Joseph near the South Fork of the Clearwater, they are no longer a neutral farming band. They have felt the impact of an arrest order carried out with rifles against a small camp, and they have heard the bragging and warnings about multi-barrel guns that stand behind the cavalry and volunteers pushing into their country. When they think about United States forts and fortified camps now, they do not picture thin lines of soldiers reloading single-shot weapons behind simple log walls. They imagine earthworks that hold cannon, clusters of barrels that can sweep open approaches, and garrisons ready to use such tools without hesitation. From this point on, any talk among the Nez Perce about charging directly against forts and entrenched camps must reckon with that image of guns that men claim can fire far faster than any warrior can move across bare ground. September 30, 1877. Cold wind blows along the Yellowstone River near Fort Keogh as Colonel Nelson Miles stands beside a line of saddled horses and looks north toward a sky streaked with thin autumn clouds. His command is ready to move. Companies from the 2nd and 7th Cavalry, mounted infantry of the 5th, Cheyenne and Lakota scouts, pack trains, and a small artillery detachment stand in loose ranks on the river flat. 2 compact Hotchkiss mountain guns and a bronze 12-pounder Napoleon cannon wait hitched to teams near the center. Their muzzles dark, their bronze and steel fittings dulled by dust from weeks of previous marching and fighting. Miles has followed the Nez Perce Trail across Montana Territory for days, pushing his men hard through breaks of badlands and long stretches of open grass. Telegraph messages and couriers report that Chief Joseph's people are close to the British line now, only a few days' ride ahead. They have already slipped away from other columns, fought through or around every force that tried to block them, and kept families, herds, and wagons together along more than 1,000 miles of flight. Miles means to stop them before they cross into Canada and join Sitting Bull's Lakota under protection of another government. He knows they are tired, low on ammunition, and burdened with wounded and elderly, yet he also knows they have fought well at every river and pass along the way. He has learned from years of chasing Southern Plains bands that surprise at dawn or early morning matters more than almost anything else. At the Red River, he saw how concentrated fire from his weapon crews broke apart a heavy Cheyenne charge that would otherwise have crashed into his wagons. He carries that memory now as he orders his own horses forward into the rising light, not planning for a slow encirclement but for a fast blow at a camp he believes still scattered and unprepared. The Hotchkiss guns, new to his command, can throw explosive shells with tight bursts of shrapnel at ranges that older smoothbores would strain to reach. They are not Gatlings, but they belong to the same idea. A few trained crews delivering far more destructive fire than earlier campaigns ever allowed. The trail north from the Yellowstone cuts through broken country, low ridges and coulees that hide movement from far-off eyes. Dust rises under every hoof and hangs over the column, blown sideways now and then by crosswinds that bite with early winter chill. Cheyenne and Lakota scouts ride ahead, spread out in a fan, studying every draw and rise for sign. Some of those scouts fought against the United States in earlier wars, and a few were present when Custer's command fell at the Little Bighorn only the previous year. Now they ride under Miles for pay and rations, their knowledge of open country turned toward finding another tribe's trail. By late morning, the scouts crest a low divide and spot a faint smear of smoke on the horizon just beyond a cluster of gently rolling hills known as the Bear Paw Mountains. From that distance, the smoke lines look thin and lazy, not the thick columns that rise when many lodges burn or a prairie fire runs unchecked. One scout drops back at a gallop, reins tight, and reports that a large camp sits near a small stream called Snake Creek, 40 miles short of the Canadian line. Miles listens, checks his watch, and decides he has no time to wait for a slow deployment. If Joseph's people break camp now, they can reach open country closer to safety by nightfall. He orders the column to tighten and prepares an attack formation. The Cheyenne and Lakota scouts will lead, followed by the 2nd Cavalry in a battalion strength line. Behind them come the 7th Cavalry as close support, then the mounted 5th Infantry acting as reserve. The Hotchkiss guns and Napoleon move with the reserve, ready to unlimber when the first strong resistance appears. Miles sends word down the line that the cavalry is to go straight for the lodges and cut into the camp before the Nez Perce can form a defensive ring. The command moves at a long trot across the last miles of prairie. Cold air stings faces and breath streams from horses' nostrils in white plumes. As they close, scouts ahead see more detail along Snake Creek. Lodges stand in a loose square near bends of the shallow water, canvas and hide mixed in uneven rows. Pony herds graze on nearby benchland, and wagons and travois stand scattered among the shelters. The people in that hollow have stopped after weeks of constant marching, believing they have outrun their pursuers long enough to rest. Miles pushes the cavalry harder. He wants the charge in motion before anyone in the camp has time to spread out, dig in, or escape. At about mid-morning, still several miles out, he signals for the 2nd Cavalry to extend into line and increase speed. Hooves pound the ground, saddles creak, and carbines slap against thighs and boots as the troopers lean forward. The scouts in front raise their own pace and drop into the shallow depressions leading toward the camp. Down at Snake Creek, Nez Perce sentries on the edge of the camp see moving dust and flashes of sunlight on metal. They shout warnings and fire shots at long range. Men run from lodges to grab rifles and cartridge belts. Others race toward the horse herds, and some begin pushing children, elders, and badly wounded toward the creek bank and nearby folds in the land. Joseph's people have believed they were close enough to Canada for a final push in a day or two. Now they see blue coats bearing down on them with less than half that distance remaining. Above them, the long line of the Bear Paw foothills offers some cover, but there is no time to dismantle the camp and move everything into the hills before the cavalry arrives. Miles's charge hits the outer edge of the camp in a rush of noise and movement. Cheyenne and Lakota scouts sweep into the pony herds, firing and shouting to scatter animals and keep them from being used by Nez Perce riders. 2nd Cavalry troopers drive between lodges, some dismounting to fight on foot, others firing from the saddle. Women and children scramble for shelter along the creek banks as bullets snap through lodge covers and throw dust from exposed patches of ground. Nez Perce warriors answer with accurate rifle fire from behind wagons, trees, and the first bits of higher ground they can reach. The result is not a one-sided rush. Within minutes, the troopers find themselves under heavy return fire from small groups that know how to use every slight rise and dip. Nez Perce marksmen drop several cavalrymen at close range, their repeating rifles working smoothly despite the haste. Horses go down screaming, and thrown riders try to crawl toward shelter while bullets strike around them. The 7th Cavalry pushes in behind the 2nd, adding numbers but also adding congestion among lodges and along the creek. Miles recognizes that the attack has lost its initial advantage. The enemy has not broken. They are regrouping and forming a ring that will be hard to crack with horse and carbine alone. He orders the infantry and artillery forward to a line of low knolls north and east of the camp, ground that gives a clear view of the creek and the benches behind it. The Hotchkiss guns are unlimbered and pointed toward clusters of Nez Perce who are pulling back into shallow draws and brushy rises. The Napoleon is set up nearby, its crew already cutting fuses and loading shell. The first Hotchkiss round fires with a sharp report, the recoil rocking the light carriage back on its trails. The shell arcs down into the far side of the camp and bursts in a shower of fragments and dust amid brush and scattered gear. A second round follows, then a third, each one aimed at places where scouts report seeing groups of defenders form. The explosions throw jagged pieces of metal across the shallow cover, cutting into bodies and splintering whatever wood stands nearby. Every burst tells the Nez Perce that the soldiers now have weapons able to reach into the hollows and reverse slopes they might otherwise use to anchor a strong defense. In response, Nez Perce fighters pull back farther from the immediate camp and begin to dig. They scoop out pits in the thin soil above Snake Creek, using knives, sticks, and bare hands to scrape depressions deep enough to shelter prone bodies. They join these pits with shallow connecting trenches where they can crawl from one firing point to another without standing. By afternoon, a rough ring of rifle pits surrounds the shattered camp on three sides, with the creek and rougher hills guarding the fourth. Within that ring, dugouts and shelter holes are hollowed for women, children, and wounded, covered with hides and brush to keep out the chill air and stray fragments. The battle shifts from a scattered clash among lodges to a siege line a few hundred yards away. Miles's troops dig their own shallow trenches and scrape breastworks of earth and rock facing the Nez Perce pits. Between the two arcs of earth lies a strip of ground covered with dead and dying horses, broken wagons, torn lodge covers, and dropped equipment. Any man who tries to cross that strip in daylight draws fire from the other side. As the day wears on, the first light snow of the season begins to fall, dampening powder and coating bodies and ground alike in a thin white layer. There is no mounted charge now, no open rush of warriors riding at the line as they once did against isolated wagon trains or small posts. The men in the pits have learned from recent fights along the Clearwater and at other crossings that open ground in front of a well-armed force is nothing but a killing space. They stay low, use their rifles carefully, and wait for soldiers to expose a shoulder, an arm, or a head above the works. On the Army side, officers remember what a properly executed mounted attack can do to a scattered field command, yet they also know that charging straight into pits and crossfire at this distance would bring nothing but heavy losses. The presence of artillery and the memory of what rapid fire can do to a close-packed group hang over every decision about movement. As night falls, wind cuts across the lines and the snow thickens. Wounded men on both sides cry out in the darkness between the trenches. Miles allows a brief truce to collect casualties, and Nez Perce and soldiers alike move cautiously into the gap with lanterns and stretchers. Some bodies are pulled back under light coverings. Others lie where they fell, too exposed to reach safely. Cheyenne scouts strip a few Nez Perce of weapons and clothing in the dark, while some Nez Perce slip forward to take cartridges from fallen soldiers, careful to stay low and move fast. On the second day, the snow stops, but the cold deepens. Both sides extend their earthworks, digging cistern-like holes where people can huddle against the wind. In the Nez Perce camp, children and elders crouch in these pits, wrapped in blankets damp from breath and melting flakes. Food is short and fires are dangerous because smoke draws fire from the guns on the hills. Mothers try to keep small hands and feet moving to hold off frostbite while the ground above their heads shakes under the impact of distant shells. The Hotchkiss guns continue to fire at intervals, each round carefully aimed. Shells burst over the pits or against the low ridges behind them, throwing more debris into already torn ground. The Napoleon adds heavier bursts, its larger rounds tearing deeper craters where they land. Miles uses the guns not as continuous bludgeons but as precise tools to pound suspected strong points in the Nez Perce line. Between barrages, his infantry keeps up a steady pattern of rifle fire, never allowing the defenders much freedom of movement. Inside one of the Nez Perce firing lines, Looking Glass moves among the pits, encouraging men and checking that each position still holds. He has led people across mountains and along rivers for months, guiding them away from direct contact whenever possible. Now, less than 2 days' hard ride from Canada, he finds his strength forced into shallow trenches within sight of the enemy's guns. During one quiet moment, he rises slightly to look over a rock at what he thinks might be approaching allies on the horizon. A soldier on the other side sees the movement and fires. The bullet strikes Looking Glass in the head, and he falls into the pit without a sound, dead before anyone can speak his name. The loss spreads quickly through the Nez Perce line. Men who respected his caution and planning feel a new weight settle on their shoulders. Chief Joseph, already burdened with decisions that weigh families against warriors, counts another leader gone. Whitebird, now one of the few senior men left unhurt, looks at the tightening ring of trenches and artillery and thinks about the border still ahead. He begins to consider slipping away with a small group rather than waiting for a final order that might never come. On the army side, Miles worries about how long his own supplies will last in these exposed positions. He fears that Sitting Bull might send Lakota from the north to break his siege, turning his advantage into a trap for his own command. He sends messages downriver and east, reporting his situation and urging more pressure on any bands that might think of answering Joseph's plight. In his own line, he rotates units in and out of the forward trenches, letting men with frozen feet and hands shuffle back to small fires in the rear while fresh companies take their place. He tells the Hotchkiss crews to hold fire until real targets appear, conserving ammunition for any attempt by the Nez Perce to break out. The days blur together under low clouds and cutting wind. Skirmishes flare along portions of the line whenever either side probes for weakness. A young lieutenant wanders too close to the Nez Perce pits during one uneasy pause and is taken prisoner, giving the defenders a bargaining chip against Miles's hold on Joseph. Negotiations flicker on and off as each side seeks some way out that does not require abandoning wounded or giving up all hope of reaching Canada. Every parley takes place under the shadow of the guns and the knowledge that any renewed fighting will add to the rows of frozen bodies between the works. On October 4th, General Howard's column finally reaches the Bear Paw line, marching in from the south after its own long chase. Howard rides into Miles's camp with a small escort, his arrival signaling to Joseph that another federal force now stands behind the first. The Nez Perce leader realizes that even if he were to break through Miles, a fresh line of blue-coated men lies within reach. The idea of charging mounted through two sets of entrenched positions past artillery and whatever rapid-fire weapons may stand in the forts and camps ahead makes no sense at all. He has seen too plainly what sustained gunfire and shell bursts have already done to his people in this small valley. On the morning of October 5th, after long talk and bitter argument among his surviving headmen, Joseph agrees to surrender his band in exchange for promises that his people will be allowed to return to their reservation land. He walks out from the pits with a small group under a white cloth and meets Miles and Howard between the lines. Behind him, exhausted men and women begin to emerge from their dugouts, some limping, some carried. They hand over rifles, carbines, and revolvers that have been nursed along every mile from the Wallowa country. Not far away, Whitebird and a group of followers slip through a gap in the cordon during the confusion and move north toward Canada, unwilling to lay down arms when the border stands that close. The siege ends, but its meaning spreads quickly beyond this cold valley. More than 400 Nez Perce surrender or are captured here, the rest reaching Canada or dying on the way. The United States claims a decisive victory and publishes reports praising the skill of its officers and the tenacity of its troops. Yet even those reports speak with respect of the Nez Perce retreat and of the stubborn defense at Bear Paw. Soldiers who fought here tell stories not of charging warriors swirling around isolated stockades, but of dug-in rifle pits, long-range fire, and artillery pounding positions that never close to hand range. In the years that follow, word of this final stand reaches camps far beyond Montana. Tribes hear how Joseph's people traveled for months, fought several engagements, and still ended ringed by trenches, guns, and columns that could move faster and hit harder than any earlier army. They hear that by the time the Nez Perce reached the Bear Paw Mountains, the era of successful open charges against United States forts and entrenched lines had already faded. From the Red River Basin to the Yellowstone and Clearwater Valley, mounted rushes into concentrated fire had led to broken horses and bodies scattered on open ground. At Bear Paw, no one tried such a charge at all, because everyone on both sides understood clearly what concentrated weapons and tight earthworks would do to men who left cover in a group. Out on the plains and in the mountain valleys, new forts rise or old posts are strengthened. Their designs assume that any future attack will face not just long lines of single-shot rifles but also machine guns and light artillery that can cover every approach with dense fire. Gatling guns, now present in many departmental arsenals and at key posts, stand ready on raised platforms behind walls of earth and timber, their clustered barrels oiled and waiting. Mounted warriors still exist, still ride and hunt, still remember the old ways of striking and pulling away. However, after Bear Paw, leaders planning resistance know that riding shoulder to shoulder toward those walls or toward a solid field line is no longer a path that leads anywhere except into the arcs of weapons built to fire faster and longer than any human arm can match. By mid-morning on July 11, 1877, smoke from cooking fires in Chief Joseph's camp along the south fork of the Clearwater drifts in thin lines up the slope toward the broken tableland above. The village sprawls along the river bottom, lodges and tents set among patches of willows and open bars of pale gravel, with horse herds grazing on the benches beyond. Gardens of potatoes and other crops mark spots where Nez Perce families have tried to plant. Even while the running war with the army spreads across their country, children chase dogs between the shelters, women move to and from the water with kettles, and older men sit near saddles and rifles, watching the ridges with narrowed eyes. Word has already come that General Oliver Otis Howard is not far behind, marching with infantry, cavalry, scouts, and guns. Up on the rolling upland to the south, Howard's column struggles forward through waist-high grass and patches of low brush. The soldiers have been in the field for weeks, following the Nez Perce Trail over mountains, across rivers, and along ridges where the heat rises in waves from bare rock. Boots are worn, uniforms stained, faces bearded and lined with fatigue. Yet the column still moves in order, companies in their assigned places, mule trains creaking under the weight of rations and ammunition, and a small artillery detachment bringing up 2 light howitzers and a single Gatling gun. Howard rides near the front, his empty sleeve pinned across his chest, using his remaining hand to steady the reins and adjust his field glasses as he glances toward the low sound of water in the valley ahead. Scouts who have ridden closer to the river return with quick reports. They say Joseph's camp stretches along the south bank with lodges, stock, and many people concentrated near a wide ford. They add that warriors have dug rifle pits on the slopes and benches above the village, shallow trenches marked by freshly turned earth and small mounds of dirt that did not exist days earlier. Howard listens and studies the ground. The Nez Perce have chosen their position carefully, with water at their backs and rough country behind them and on their flanks. Any attempt to rush them straight on will push his troops across open slopes under fire from men who know how to shoot from cover. He decides to seize the heights before anything else. Infantry companies are ordered to swing toward the ridge above the river, using folds in the land for what little protection they offer. The artillery detachment is told to bring the guns up to a point where their fire can reach the lodges and the pits above them. The Gatling's carriage creaks and jolts as its team hauls it along a rough track cut by earlier riders, wheels bumping over stones. The clustered barrels wrapped in canvas to keep dust from grinding into the mechanism. Men strain at the wheel rims and trail handles during the steepest stretches, breathing hard as they urge the piece toward the crest. Nez Perce watchers on the slopes and among the willows see the movement at once. Riders swing up onto bareback horses and gallop along the riverbank to spread the alarm. Warriors grab rifles and cartridge belts, run toward the positions they have prepared, and throw themselves into the shallow trenches that mark their chosen lines. Some scooped out their pits days earlier when it became clear that the army would not stop at the Salmon or the Snake. From these notches they can see both the river and the tableland, and they plan to fire at any soldier who shows himself on the skyline. Joseph moves through the camp on foot and on horseback, speaking to people as he passes. He does not shout or wave his arms, Those who know him recognize his calm voice as he urges families to be ready to move if the fighting goes badly. Women begin packing hurriedly, tying bundles, loading travois, and bringing in children from the water's edge. Herd boys move the horses toward ground that can be reached quickly if the order comes to flee, yet still close enough that riders can mount in time to cover a withdrawal. Looking Glass and other leaders focus on the rifle pits and the men who will hold them, telling them to make every shot count, to use the trenches and rock outcrops to keep their bodies low. On the ridge, Howard's lead companies reach the crest and look down. Below them, the river coils along its channel, reflecting pale light through the haze. The camp lies in plain view, and faint figures can be seen moving between the lodges and the pits on the benches. Howard orders the guns forward. The howitzers are unlimbered first, their muzzles pointed down toward the river bottom, crews already cutting fuses and preparing shell. Beside them, the Gatling is hauled into place, its wheels chocked with stones, its barrel cluster freed from its canvas cover. The crew works quickly. One man opens the ammunition boxes and lifts out rows of shiny metallic cartridges, stacking them near the feed hopper. Another checks the crank, gears, and breech parts with practiced touches, feeling for anything that might bind after the first few shots. The gun captain stands behind the handle, watching the infantry skirmishers spread below and to either side, ready to begin turning as soon as the order comes. From the perspective of the men lying in the pits on the lower slopes, the figure behind the clustered barrels looks small, but the threat that machine represents is clear. They have heard about weapons that can fire as fast as a man can move his arm, and now they can see one in position above their homes. Howard gives the signal for the attack to begin. The howitzers fire first, each piece belching smoke and flame as shell arcs down toward the camp. Explosions blossom among the lodges and along the riverbank, throwing dirt, splinters, and fragments into the air. Horses rear and bolt, some breaking loose from their tethers, others going down where they stand. Shouts and cries rise from the village as people dive for what cover they can find behind low banks, trees, and the slight shelter of lodge poles. Then the Gatling joins in. The captain starts the crank slowly, sending the first cartridges into the chambers. The gun coughs out a few single reports while the mechanism cycles through its early turns. He picks up speed, settling into a firm, even motion that pulls the breech through its steps and brings each barrel to the firing point in quick succession. Very soon, the separate cracks merge into a steady, hard beat that rolls along the ridge and down into the valley. Bullets tear into the open ground and the lighter structures below. Dust and splinters fly where the rounds strike lodge frames, hit tree trunks, or slam into the rocky benches near the pits. Warriors in those trenches feel the air above their heads cut by more than sporadic rifle fire. It now pulses with constant impacts that chew at any exposed crest. Those who try to raise their rifles high enough to take careful aim at figures on the ridge find they have to work between bursts, using brief lulls or shifts in the gun's angle. The machine does not give them the long, regular gaps that older patterns of fire would have offered. Infantry skirmishers begin to move down from the ridge, using folds in the ground for cover while the Gatling and howitzers keep up their harassment. They advance by rushes, one small group dashing forward while another stays prone and ready to fire. Every time a Nez Perce marksman shows himself too high in his pit, a cluster of soldiers on the crest or on the slope below concentrate fire on that spot. The Gatling captain sweeps the barrels back and forth along the fringe of visible earthworks, forcing heads down and limiting the ability of the defenders to pick specific targets. The combination of artillery, machine gun fire, and advancing riflemen stretches the defenders' attention in several directions at once. On the lower benches, Nez Perce fighters listen to the shell bursts and the relentless rhythm of the machine gun while the hills seem to shake around them. They trade signs and shouted words between pits whenever the noise dips low enough to allow it. Their rifles are good, many of them repeaters, and they know how to make every round count. But the pattern from the ridge is not something they can answer in kind. When they see soldiers try to cross open patches, they pick their moments and fire, dropping a man or forcing a group to flatten against the ground. Yet every successful shot brings more focused fire from above, and the edges of their pits continue to erode under the impact of bullets. In the camp, amid the falling debris and the chaos caused by bursting shells, women and older children drag belongings toward the brush and ravines that lead away from the river. Lodges take hits and collapse, some catching fire as flaming fragments land on them. Men who are not in the front pits help get the most vulnerable away from the immediate killing zone, then run back toward the fighting line when they can. They know that if the soldiers break through to the village while families are still within reach of the camp center, the result will be a slaughter. The aim is to hold long enough to let as many as possible climb into the rough country beyond the immediate valley. As the day wears on, the heat intensifies. Sweat runs into soldiers' eyes as they reload and fire on the slopes, and the Gatling crew members feel their arms and shoulders burn from the constant motion of the crank and the lifting of ammunition. The barrels of the machine gun grow very hot, shimmering in the air when men glance down the length of the cluster. Between bursts, the crew pours water over the frame and wipes away fouling to keep the action moving. Empty brass cases pile at the base of the carriage, bright metal half buried in the trampled dirt. By afternoon, Howard's men have edged closer to the pits in several sectors at the cost of casualties scattered along the slopes and on the ridge. Some infantry reach positions above parts of the Nez Perce line, firing down into angles that the original trenches were not designed to cover. The defenders, skilled and stubborn, refuse to panic. They shift from one pit to another, use gullies and small rock shelves, and continue to shoot whenever a soldier exposes too much of his body. Even with the Gatling suppressing large portions of the line, every yard of ground costs effort and lives. As dusk approaches, the noise slackens. Both sides have taken losses, and neither can see clearly enough to press a fresh assault in the failing light. Howard holds a council with his officers near the guns, deciding to maintain pressure but not to throw his men into the river bottom in the dark. The Gatling is cleaned and checked once more, then left under guard, ready to resume at first light. Below in the Nez Perce camp, wounded are tended in the shadows of the remaining lodges and among the rocks of the draws. Leaders talk in low voices about what the first day has shown them and what options remain. During the night, Nez Perce families begin to move. Using the cover of darkness, they lead ponies and pack animals up faint trails into the broken hills east of the river. Warriors remain in the trenches or close to them, listening for any sign that Howard's men are trying to cross the slopes under cover of the dark. Occasional shots crack back and forth, but there is no general attack. Each side knows the other is near, yet neither wants to stumble blindly into a trap on ground that still holds dead and wounded from the day's action. The sound of low voices, the rustle of brush, and the splash of the river carry to those who lie awake on both sides. At dawn on July 12, the light reveals the damage done. Parts of the camp are flattened, some lodges burned or torn, gear scattered along the bank. On the slopes above, bodies lie where they fell, marked by dark stains in the dust. Howard orders the guns to resume. The howitzers send shell toward targets that appear to hold clusters of defenders, while the Gatling once again sweeps likely positions along the line of pits and rock ledges. Infantrymen who survived the first day prepare to move forward again, knowing what kind of fire met them the previous morning. Nez Perce defenders now have fewer pits fully manned, but those who remain still fight hard. They rise just enough to fire, then drop again as the air above their positions fills with chips of earth and stone. They see soldiers advancing in short rushes, lying behind small rises, using every tree trunk and boulder for what cover they can find. Some warriors decide that continued defense in these same trenches will only lead to more dead men and fewer fighters available for the next stages of the flight north. Under the direction of their leaders, they begin to pull back by sections, slipping out of the line and into the rougher country beyond as opportunities appear. Howard's men slowly push closer to the river. Skirmishers reach abandoned pits and find them shallow and narrow, just big enough for a few men to lie in. Spent cartridge cases litter the bottoms, mixed with bits of clothing, blood, and broken tools used to scrape the earth. From these new vantage points, soldiers fire at the last visible Nez Perce marksmen who are still covering the withdrawal of families and herds into the hills. The Gatling now fires in shorter bursts, directed more precisely at isolated pockets of resistance. Each burst still has an effect far beyond its visible impact, because anyone considering a stand on open slope can hear how fast those barrels still work. By late morning, the main Nez Perce force is already on the move away from the river, climbing into rugged country where no guns on wheels can easily follow. They leave behind the ruins of the camp, some dead, some badly hurt who must be carried or hidden, and the marks of their struggle etched into the dirt and rock. Howard's troops, ground down by the fight, do not have the strength to chase them immediately into that harsh terrain. The general knows that the Clearwater battle has not finished the war, yet he also understands that his use of artillery and the Gatling gun has denied the Nez Perce any chance to turn this engagement into a decisive defeat of his column. The tribe has slipped away, but only after taking punishment that will weigh on every next step of their flight. For the soldiers who stood near the Gatling on the ridge, the memory of these 2 days fixes itself in small details. They recall the smell of hot oil and powder, the way the crank felt under the hand when turned for hours across both days, the sight of dust jumping in tight lines where bullets struck. They talk about how the machine pinned down trenches that might otherwise have poured steady rifle fire into their friends on the slopes. Some say, openly, that without that gun, the ridge and the ground below it might have become another place where a column was broken and scattered. Others think more quietly about what it meant for families in the camp below to live, even for a short time, under the kind of sustained fire that no human arm alone could have delivered. Among the Nez Perce, stories of Clearwater dwell on the courage of those who held the pits, the pain of the wounded and the dead, and the sight of lodges and gardens destroyed from above. People speak of the sound that came from the ridge, not just the boom of howitzers, but the continuous rattle that cut the air in a way no ordinary volley could. They describe earth shaved away at the edges of their shelters and trees chewed by many impacts. They remember shifting by inches to stay below the level where bullets sliced through the air. And they tell younger listeners how they had to choose movement into the hills over any final stand near the river. From then on, whenever talk turns to fighting the Army's forts or entrenched camps, the memory of those days on the South Fork of the Clearwater stands as a warning about what happens when open charges meet weapons built to send out fire as long as a man's arm can keep turning a handle.